Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. It is a new year, 2025, and you, the viewers, have spoken. You want more Spectator TV at greater length. And we thought since you missed our old show, The Week in 60 Minutes, we would give you a weekly show which we're sort of tentatively calling The Week. Let's begin with James Heale talking to Michael Taube about Canada.
Now, in the last hour, we've learned that Justin Trudeau is going to be resigning shortly as the Prime Minister of Canada, having been in office since 2015.
Over the holidays, I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
Michael, could you start by telling us why now? Why has Justin Trudeau chose to go when election is due by October?
I think a lot of us have been saying for the past few years, James, why hasn't he gone years ago? This is what's actually been kind of astonishing. This has been a process which has dragged out at a level we've never seen in this country, and certainly for other countries, whether they follow the Westminster model like you and I do, our country, my country, and your country, or otherwise. It has been a very frustrating scenario that has turned off, obviously, conservatives to begin with, but has gradually included Liberals, New Democrats, and others that I'm sure we'll talk about, to the point where close to 70% of the country, according to a recent poll, has suggested that Justin Trudeau, before today's announcement, should resign or quit immediately. That's a number that's unheard of in our country. And although obviously Liz Truss in your country had sort of debatable numbers that way, I think generally speaking in Canada, where we've had obviously leaders who have taken, as they call the proverbial walk in the snow, like his late father Pierre Trudeau did, Justin Trudeau has just been an incredibly stubborn person, and not only the worst prime minister in this country's history, in my opinion, according to a recent piece I wrote for your publication, but also the most delusional. Many things that we'll get into.
And so talk us through the time frame now. So he gave this press conference this afternoon, and he says that he will be resigning as Liberal leader when a replacement can be found. How do you think the next couple of weeks and months are going to unfold?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, he has prorogued Parliament until March 24th. So one assumes that from today, January 6th to March 24th, there will be some sort of a leadership race. Now, that's up to the Liberal Party to determine. They have to choose within their organization when it's going to start, any deadlines that they'll have for candidates who are forthcoming, of which some we may talk about, and how the procedure is going to go from there. But it's been said now on organizations like CBC and CTV, two of Canada's national TV networks, that it has to be decided quickly, that this long, drawn-out process we've seen with Justin Trudeau and the highs and lows, mostly lows, that he's experienced as Prime Minister, it can't go on for much longer. So a decision will have to be made shortly, but by proroguing Parliament until March 24th, he's obviously gained some additional time.
What did you make of that press conference? He spoke for about half an hour. He repeatedly said he was a fighter, not a quitter, words that our very own Liz Truss also used shortly before she also resigned. He said he was quitting. Why do you think it's reached this crisis point? Was it all those people coming out over Christmas and saying, frankly, all the different caucuses saying, frankly, we no longer have faith in him anymore?
Well, it certainly doesn't help when the three major party caucuses that have historically supported the Liberal Party, that being the province of Ontario, the province of Quebec, and Atlantic Canada in general, which is an entire region, when all of them come out and say that they want him gone, James, that is basically a clear sign that even someone as delusional as Mr. Trudeau must recognize is a problem. And I would think that he would understand this. I think at that point he realized it, but the issue that probably struck a nerve more than anything, and I have, and many others have included laundry lists of mistakes and blunders and other things that this prime minister has made since he was first elected in 2015. The biggest issue that I think tilted everything was the resignation, an abrupt one, of his deputy prime minister and finance minister, or then Chrystia Freeland, who has been one of the most liberal, loyal ministers he's had, and also one of the most respected within the Liberal caucus itself. When she basically came out and said that the proverbial bus had been rolled over with Mr. Trudeau driving it, and stating that he had lost confidence in her ability, that she obviously was clearly frustrated and furious, and I'm naturally just paraphrasing from her lines, but you could see the anger and the anguish that was within her words and within her news release. This was someone who had stood by him the whole way. Now, in private, we have no idea. She might have felt the same thing. She might have felt differently. But I think she finally realized that the self-described liberal feminist prime minister, who's had a lot of issues with other female ministers, cabinet ministers especially, but even his parliamentary secretary as well, I think she came to the realization that if even she's not safe here, and clearly he will do anything to stay in power. That's not surprising when you consider the nature of politics and leadership, but I'm sure to her, having been a loyalist for so long, it was probably a stinging blow that she never saw coming. And I think that was really the final straw, not only for her, but also Liberals who had backed Mr. Trudeau for whatever reason for so long. And I think they all realized that the time had come, even though the polls had actually shown that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, who are the opposition party of this country, have been far, far ahead for over 2 years and in double digits for more than a year. The time had come.
And you mentioned there about Pierre Poilievre. I mean, how do you think the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks or so, as the Liberals try and find another leader to take over from Trudeau, how do you think they should play that? On the one hand, obviously, in some ways it's a great success. They finally got rid of Trudeau, who won successive elections. But on the other, of course, you know, they sort of have to wait and can't intrude on private grief because it's up to the Liberals to decide who's better than Trudeau.
I think that's an apt description. Yes. I mean, I think the next 8 weeks are going to be a period of very quick decisions, very quick moving. You know, they'll be scurrying like mice to try and get this done. And that's understandable because they realize that time is of the essence. Even if the Liberals cannot survive government, which most likely the next federal election will be this year at some point, many of them want to save their own political hides, that being their own seats. Therefore, they're going to get their act together as quickly as they can, ensuring that it's probably a small contingent of leadership candidates, because if it's too big, it's going to be a bit of a mess. Some of them will probably heavily back people like Ms. Freeland, one assumes will probably run. Mark Carney, who many of your viewers may remember as the former Bank of UK governor and former Bank of Canada governor as well. He is certainly a viable candidate. Dominic LeBlanc, who is a close friend of Mr. Trudeau for many years and currently is finance minister. He sort of was pushed into the role very last minute after Ms. Freeland abruptly resigned. Those sorts of people are going to be out front and center, along with other ministers like Melanie Joly and other names that are not of a pressing importance to many of the listeners and people that you're probably not going to be familiar with to start with, but they would be regarded as major contenders for the Liberal leadership and ultimately the next prime minister of this country. So in a nutshell, they have to move very quickly in these next X weeks, because in 8 weeks' time, he's going to be gone, supposedly. Parliament will no longer be prorogued. A vote of non-confidence in this parliament is possible, and we could see a very fast turnover in a very quick election or a long, drawn-out process. We'll see.
In some ways, as you say, Justin Trudeau's death has been very long and drawn out, even if it's now come to a very quick resolution. Tell us why Pierre Poilievre has been so successful in the polls for his leadership, as you say, leading now for 2 years. How has he been able to kind of remake the Conservatives into this now apparently hegemonic force, winning by-elections last year, and according to some polls, 25 points ahead of the Liberals?
I met Pierre a very long time ago, more than most. I knew him when he was an intern in the political party, which shows the gray hair on my head, but and some appearing on his too. But regardless, I knew very early on, as a lot of people did, that there was a real force there. Someone who was very intelligent, very knowledgeable, very policy-oriented, and very much a small C conservative, both politically and economically, and culturally as well. We saw someone who could be a viable replacement for, or a new good conservative leader to, Stephen Harper whenever he had chosen to resign. Now, this was years ago. Mr. Harper, as we know, left as prime minister in 2015. It's been a volatile period of time for the Conservatives. They've had two other leaders, Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole, Both of them were leading into the election periods of 2019 and 2021, respectively. But in both cases, unfortunately, there were mishaps, slip-ups, most of which is obviously just either a period of inside baseball or just domestic issues that just caused the end. This is where Pierre Poilievre is different, James. Pierre Poilievre is an intelligent, studious individual. He has learned from the mistakes of previous conservative leaders since Mr. Harper left in 2015, and he's learned not only in terms of how to create a good formula of leadership and how to actually lead the country, he's built a conservative brand sort of a la Boris Johnson in the UK, Scott Morrison in Australia, even Donald Trump a little bit in the United States, although all of them are clearly very different than Mr. Poilievre, where you've basically tied in conservative ideas and a populist type ideology, where you've encouraged people who are not naturally conservatives, they weren't born that way, they don't vote that way typically, to look into conservative ideas that would make sense for them about the economy, about politics in general. But Mr. Poilievre has also even gone further by trying to encourage non-conservative Canadians to look at him by looking at issues that matter to them. The affordability crisis that we're currently having in Canada, high housing rates, high energy rates. He has looked at certain things, even like cryptocurrency briefly, issues and ideas that don't necessarily fit into the conservative wheelhouse, but he has found a way to sort of build upon them, much like the Republican Party in the United States. The old liberal Republicans used to find ways to tie themselves together, say, to the working class. That is to Mr. Poilievre's credit. It's not something that, quite frankly, I or many other conservatives would have naturally given him as advice, but he's not only taken it, he's ridden it incredibly well and has done exceedingly well with this platform, to the point that many Canadians, no matter their political stripe, are encouraged by what Mr. Poilievre has to say. That, combined with Mr. Trudeau's foibles, has led Mr. Poilievre to be in a position to become the next Prime Minister, and barring something extremely unforeseen, which I don't think even most Liberals believe will happen, Mr. Poilievre will become the next Prime Minister of this country, but he's done it by building bridges to individuals, communities, families, and others who don't naturally or inherently support or vote Conservative.
Mr. Poilievre may well be the next big dominant figure for the next decade in Canada. We've mentioned Stephen Harper, who had that role from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. Why then did Justin Trudeau, why was he so successful for so long? He, as you said, had many foibles, and yet somehow was able to keep winning 3 successive elections. Tell us why you think he was so successful for so long.
In a nutshell, there was a fair bit of luck in it, but there was also a little tiny bit of skill in the beginning, and I'll explain it this way. Stephen Harper, who's my old friend and my old boss, because I worked for him as his speechwriter and various other capacities, had been Prime Minister for roughly about 10 years. As you know, James, in your country, there is a period of time when the voters get antsy or tired of the government in power. We saw that recently in your country last year. Unfortunately, it happened to mine as well in 2015. It had less to do with Stephen Harper, but more to do with the change of minds or change of hearts of many voters. So for that reason, Justin Trudeau was able to get in with a completely different program, a completely different formula. And it was kind of astonishing because in the previous federal election in 2011, the Liberals under Michael Ignatieff had fallen to 34 seats, which was a record low for that government and that party in its long history. Yet somehow in 4 years, Mr. Trudeau was able to rebuild it based on some of the reasons that I provided. Since that time, and I know this sounds partisan, but it really is true, it has been the luck of fools that he has survived this long. And the reality is because the Conservatives mostly have made mistakes that they shouldn't have at the worst possible times. As I alluded to, Mr. Scheer and Mr. O'Toole, both fine leaders, both had many good qualities, both would have been fine prime ministers. They made a lot of mistakes during the campaigns and even the lead-in to them that led to, unfortunately, many Canadians who were concerned about conservative ideas and policies, which are not natural in my country. Just because I'm appearing here doesn't mean there are a lot of them. Many Canadians by nature are middle of the road. They tend to historically support the Liberal Party, who is governing this country roughly about 70% of the time, give or take, of this country's history since 1867. For that reason, they feel more comfortable in left of center or progressive parties like the Liberal Party. So for that reason, he got very lucky. Because his opponents kept making mistakes, he survived, but he was barely surviving. In 2019 and 2021, for example, he didn't win a majority of support in either election, but because of the first past the post system we have due to the Westminster model, he survived continually and had governments that were minority governments, but he found ways to exist in 2019, and in 2021, he made a supply and confidence agreement with Jagmeet Singh and the New Democratic Party, who are Canada's basically socialist alternative, to keep them in power for an extended period of time. And Mr. Singh and the NDP, to their detriment, decided to keep him in power for a long time because they liked power, they craved it, and quite frankly, Mr. Singh, like many Canadian politicians, is getting closer to his pension, as we like to call it in Canada, gold-plated pension kicking in. He's only a few weeks away. Some believe, and it's hard to say because he obviously has publicly denied it, that he may have had ulterior motives why he was continuing to do it. But regardless, that's really how he survived, James. And I know that sounds simplistic, but it's really true because of the litany of mistakes, errors, blunders, pitfalls that this prime minister has had, both nationally and internationally. In any other time, with almost any other prime minister, even my old friend Mr. Harper, it would have been incredibly impossible to survive. Yet just by luck, he has hung on. And I think finally, at long last today, the end is near.
And so tell us, as a final question then, what do you think Justin Trudeau's legacy as Canadian Prime Minister will be?
You know, I hate being rude or nasty on things like this. I try not to be. I mean, it's hard sometimes, but we've all tried to bite our tongues as best we can because it's only fair. That's the position you and I are in or others are in. And if we just come out, with our fists of fury, it's not going to do anything and it doesn't benefit the discussion. Intellectual discourse still does mean something. But the fact is that his legacy is going to be a poor one. Like I said, this is the worst prime minister in Canadian history. It's not even comparable to the ones who struggled. Even Kim Campbell, for example, who some of your listeners may remember, or viewers may remember, who was a horrible prime minister, she would actually have been much better compared to him. Even poor Mr. Ignatieff with his 34 seats would have probably been a better option for the Liberals today than Mr. Trudeau. I don't really know what his legacy will be. He thinks that he accomplished a lot. He's delusional enough to believe that he did much in 9+ years as prime minister, but all he did was hurt the country, make it poorer, make it less credible on the international scene, and make it weaker overall. A thing that Mr. Harper tried to correct, and even though I disagree with him, former Liberal prime ministers like Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, who some of you may be familiar with, I had many policy disagreements with them, but no one ever dismissed the fact that they were trying to do something as leaders. Even if you disagreed with it, you understood what the motives were. Mr. Trudeau's legacy is that he just skipped along, somehow survived, made comments like, budgets will balance themselves. They didn't care about the federal deficit, making up words like people kind, going into NAFTA negotiations with Donald Trump, looking at issues like gender rights and indigenous rights instead of the most important one, yes, trade. If you look at all those things, you see a prime minister who was not cut out for this job. This is a person who should never have been near it. His father, Pierre Trudeau, for all his faults, all his mistakes, was a political animal. He understood political communications. He understood strategy. He knew what to do. His son, Justin, failed at every level to accomplish anything of those tasks. And that's why I've written a couple of times that his father would be ashamed of him or embarrassed by him, because what he has done has really reduced the Liberal Party brand and his own political brand to almost nothing. If that's a legacy, well, I'd like to know what a good legacy is.
That's enough Canada for now. Let's turn to the ongoing row between Keir Starmer and Elon Musk. Katy Bulls, James Heale, and the Telegraph's Tim Stanley discuss it.
It's been a big week for Elon Musk and Labour and Nigel Farage. So tell us all about what's happened in the last 48 hours or so.
Well, there's obviously so many different angles to what has been the return might even be the wrong word, but the grooming gang scandal going to the top of the news agenda, largely thanks to the tweets of Elon Musk. Now, I think has been discussed in depth on this podcast and on Spectator TV. The largest part of that story is about child grooming gangs, what happened, and where there'll be an inquiry. But it has dominated Westminster in such a way that it's now having ramifications for every party leader. And I think for Keir Starmer, it's clearly incredibly uncomfortable. Not even just because he has Elon Musk directly saying that he is the problem, suggesting that he, should be in jail and so forth, and his ministers. But also when you think about Labour's electoral base, the fact that they lost a lot of the Muslim vote in the general election, hope to get that back by the time of the next one. It's just a complicated situation for them in terms of their political calculations, as well as the questions being asked about whether there should be an inquiry, and it means it's hard for them to find a place to go. Then you have the Tories who are trying to lean into this, saying we have done some work in government with our task force, and we actually think there should be an inquiry. But Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick are, of course, fast discovering the issue with being incumbents for a lot of that time period. And then you have Nigel Farage, who initially seemed to be the beneficiary is probably the wrong word to use in this type of situation, but seemed to probably be the leader who was best placed to make a political point on it and to lead the charge for an inquiry. And then, of course, Nigel Farage, who has a good relationship with Elon Musk, or at least did, who of course visited him in America along with the new treasurer Nick Candy, posed for that photos. One of the big stories ahead of Christmas was, will they get £100 million from Elon Musk through one of his companies? And if not, will they get a couple of million, which would still be a huge donation by UK standards. Only for Elon Musk to then tweet saying, Nigel Farage doesn't have what it takes and they need a new leader, which I think on the Sunday was probably a plot twist we thought would happen at some point, just knowing the personalities, but one that we probably expected in about Series 3, not Episode 3 of Series 1. And from that point, obviously, Reform MPs bandying around Nigel Farage, but also questions as to, well, will Reform now get this money? I think it's fair to say that Elon Musk's tweet took the Reform team by surprise. Yeah. A lot of thought about how to respond to it. And now the question, which is, has Nigel Farage's response, and even that divide in the first place, which is, all comes down to Tommy Robinson, the jailed activist. The fact that Elon Musk says free him and almost talks to him as a martyr. Nigel Farage takes a very different view, says he won't be welcome in Reform. And he's stuck by that view, saying, if that means I don't get money from Elon Musk, that's not such a bad thing. I like Elon Musk very much, but I'm not going to go on my principles. Doesn't mean Nigel Farage now comes out in a better light than before. I think there's certainly some in the Reform Party who think this could be useful for showing Reform as a party of the mainstream, not as some critics want to say, a party of the hard right.
Tim, how do you think Nigel Farage has handled all this? You've written about this for The Telegraph.
I met Nigel Farage on Boxing Day. I met him to interview him at a Fox Hunt meet, which has to be the most right-wing thing I've ever done, spending Boxing Day with Nigel Farage surrounded by foxhounds. And at that time, he called Elon Musk a bloody hero. He meant really bloody hero to young people in particular who were attracted to reform, but it sounded like a full-throttled endorsement. And then just a few days later, Elon Musk turns on him. And of course, initially we thought, how embarrassing. And that's the way that a lot of people, particularly left-wingers, responded to it, that it was like a twist in an episode of Emmerdale. But the reality is that it actually has given Nigel Farage an opportunity to say, I am not in favour of Tommy Robinson. There are limits to how close I'm willing to get to American politicians, and I'm actually prepared on a point of principle to say no to millions of pounds of donations because I will not be associated with that kind of far-right politics. So I think he has actually handled it well, and it has helped to make him look like a far more independent and moderate figure than many thought he was just a few days before. Now, what's interesting is that he has since hinted that he is willing to mend bridges between him and Elon. And that could be the next plot twist. Will there be some sort of reconciliation? Because the key thing here is, how does this affect relationships between Trump and Farage? That's what really matters. Because Nigel Farage is, at present, the political figure in Britain who is closest to the incoming president. And he's just had an almighty row with Donald Trump's latest best buddy, Elon Musk. So is that going to put a wedge between his relationship with the new administration? And how then does that affect relationships between Britain and America? So there's going to be a lot of attention paid over the inauguration. Does Nigel make up with Musk? Does Trump say something about all this and get involved? Either way, it puts Nigel at the heart of British politics, which is remarkable when you consider they've only got 5 MPs. But it comes against the backdrop of Reform gaining in the polls, such that in one, Reform had become the second party.
And, of course, that is one thing that Nigel Farage has been focusing his week on. The other, of course, is pressing ahead with the calls for an inquiry into the grooming gangs. This morning, Reform UK have been out talking about, they will say, look, if there's not going to be a public inquiry, we're going to hold our own, effectively a private inquiry. Talk us about the approach that he's taking versus, say, that of the Conservatives, Katy.
Well, they're both in pretty similar positions, I would say, on this. Both are calling for this inquiry. I mean, Reform have now said they'll do it themselves. We're yet to have the DIY inquiry offer from the Tories. But the Tories are instead trying to go through parliamentary means to force Labour's hand or to guilt Labour MPs enough that they decide to launch a full inquiry. But the general aim and end result is the same. And I think that when you think about, I suppose, the point that Nigel Farage has found himself at, I mean, we get back to Elon Musk, not to make everything about Elon Musk, but, it has been noted by criminologists of X that Elon Musk has gone back to quote tweeting Nigel Farage in a way that is not negative. So to Tim's point, I think that the friendship / relationship is not dead. It's just there's been a bit of turbulence, but Elon Musk still seems to like Reform and is flirting a little bit with the Tories at the same time, because Robert Jenrick gets retweeted, Kemi Badenoch on a good day gets retweeted, and then also Nigel Farage. And in terms of where that goes, I mean, I think there's a question as to probably what we saw on Sunday is, I don't think it is in the interest of a party leader to fall out with Elon Musk. But I also think there's probably a lesson in not staking too much of your leadership on it. And that's why I would still say it's probably been a little bit embarrassing for Nigel Farage what's happened in the past week, or the Reform Party. I think he's handled it probably the best he could in terms of his response to it. But of course, it was the Reform Party that was building up Elon Musk as a key ally of theirs, flying to America, releasing the photos, almost in a gloating way, talking about the fact they might get donations in a way that spooked the Tories and Labour. And that might also happen, but they built Elon Musk up as the champion Reform to the point that it suddenly mattered a bit more than it would have done otherwise when he said no to Nigel Farage, and everyone started saying, well, he seems to like Rupert Lowe's tweets. So I think that there's some bumps there, but you can imagine that they go. And I also think Nigel Farage only met Elon Musk for the first time a month or so ago. It was at Mar-a-Lago. Ultimately, it was the celebration for Donald Trump winning, whereas his relationship with Donald Trump goes back a much longer time. And we are so far at the moment, Donald Trump is very demure next to Elon Musk in terms of what he is saying publicly about the UK and so forth. And you look at, Susie Wiles, you look at some people in Donald Trump's team, and it feels, there is at least a strong wing of his team who are not going for such a combative approach at the moment as the one Elon Musk is. So I suspect Nigel Farage's relationships with the White House are still better than any other UK political leader. In terms of where I think we go to next on the grooming gang scandal, you have Robert Jenrick. He managed to secure the 8:10 slot today on the Today programme.
Prestigious.
Much to the delight of Robert Jenrick's supporters. He's now being accused, by the BBC and others of almost politicising this because he didn't speak about it enough times in the chamber previously and so forth. And then you have the previous chair of the inquiry suggesting that another inquiry is not needed. So I think we're reaching the point where anyone talking about this as a politician is now at the risk of being told you're doing this for your own gain and so forth. But I think it has crossed that point now where there are enough forces, I think, in terms of the press, in terms of politics, in terms of the country, talking about the need for another inquiry, one that would specifically look at how grooming gangs worked, that I think it's hard to dismiss, anyone talking about it as completely dishonest or self-serving. And the other element is the Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch relationship at the moment, because, you have some saying, well, if there are these prime slots on the broadcast today, shouldn't the Tory leader, who some say isn't out there enough, be going out and doing it? Or is she trusting her Shadow Justice Secretary, but one-time leadership rival, who some think might still have ambitions to do it? And also, who's leading who in terms of where the rhetoric is going, because Jenrick has gone further than some in the party would go. Kemi Baden has so far defended him, but I think it's interesting to see, does it get to a point where he goes, another step further than she would?
Yeah, talk about joined up opposition. Tim, what did you make of Keir Starmer's press conference yesterday? He was at pains not to try and antagonise Elon Musk with his comments. He referred only once briefly to him by name. How do you think the reaction has gone down to what he said as he tried to react to what Musk said, while also attempting to talk about the NHS?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
It was a disaster. Bear in mind that the whole point of this was to reset the government for the new year and talk about the NHS. And actually, Labour's policies in that are pretty bold. He talked about the NHS shouldn't be a money pit. He talked about using the private sector. But when it came to the questions, the media, of course, wanted to talk about the grooming gang scandal and Elon Musk. And initially, Starmer tried to dismiss the Musk angle and say, I'm not going to talk about that and I'm going to focus on, and he gave a defense of his role when he was DPP in the child grooming. And then he seemed to get goaded by it, and he really got into it, and he gave a full throttle defense of Jez Phillips, and he attacked the Tories and suggested that unnamed Tory MPs, I suspect he meant Rob Jenrick, are jumping on a far-right bandwagon. And by so doing, he came across as stonkingly tone deaf. This issue gets to the heart of what I see, which is this extraordinary cultural divide between the rest of Britain and Westminster and the different ways in which they think about issues. The view of Labour is actually quite a reasonable one. It's that this scandal happened over 10 years ago. Some of the cases that have been dredged up in the last few days are 2 decades old. They say when Keir Starmer was DPP, he enforced the law, prosecuted people, and at the time, he and other Labour people did say that race should not be a factor that in any way clouds investigations of rape. So as far as they're concerned, and then there was an inquiry, which, as they say, covered all forms of child abuse, which produced recommendations, which Labour point out the Tories then didn't act on. So from Labour's point of view, the only reason why you would suddenly jump on this story is because you are being goaded by Elon Musk to antagonise people, wind up the public, and you're doing that largely because you want to point the finger at Asian migrants. That's Labour's point of view. And then the Tories look at this and go, but the issue is the rape of children. The issue is not the politics around this. The issue is not Elon Musk. The point is this horrific thing happened some time ago, and we never properly discussed why or how it happened or the consequences of it. And yes, there was an inquiry, but the inquiry didn't deal specifically with what they call Pakistani heritage grooming gangs. So therefore, we need another one. So to return to Westminster after having been away, I found the atmosphere there very ugly. And it's because Labour MPs don't like being accused of being soft on paedophilia. But Tory MPs don't like being accused of being Nazis. Right? This gets to the heart of that cultural, emotional division between left and right. But ultimately, blame for this thing spiralling out of control really lies with Keir Starmer, because to go back to that press conference, this was an opportunity for him to articulate a sense of anger and disgust at the scandal. And instead, in a very bureaucratic fashion, he defended his record. Of course he condemned child grooming, of course he did. But he basically defended his record, defended Jez Phillips, and tried to turn this into a matter of honour for the left that was being slandered by Rob Jenrick. And by so doing, totally failed to articulate that sense of horror that the rest of the public has. Because GB News has been pushing this story, in the last few weeks, and because it's been picked up by Elon Musk, a lot of ordinary voters are discovering what happened in places like Rotherham for the first time. And when they read these stories, they think, how did this ever happen? And why weren't these people properly investigated? Why weren't they prosecuted for racially aggravated crimes as well as everything else? And they just want a politician who can say, yeah, I get it. It's horrific and disgusting, and Britain should be ashamed that this was allowed to happen. And right now it feels, it might be incoherent, it might be dumb, but it actually feels like Elon Musk's ignorant tweets better reflect the emotion of ordinary British people than politicians who are going into damage control.
That's it.
And that's the fundamental problem. This story should not be going in the direction it's going. It's not going because the Prime Minister can't control it. He's emotionally and politically out of his depth, and he doesn't know how to ride events like this.
And you can see the UK government and Keir Starmer trying to say, hey, we have a grip on some of these things and we're responding. Look, we're bringing in 2 of the recommendations from the inquiry in the first place. You've had that announcement from the Home Office. But I think while you have the other party saying, no, go a bit further, and to Tim's point, it feels at times that Keir Starmer's more upset at the potential personal threats against one of his own ministers than talking about it as a wider issue. It means I don't think it feels there's too much of a lid on this at the moment. And I think that there's also this strange triangulation of when you go back to that press conference, I think that Downing Street are of the view they did not have any personal barbs at Elon Musk. So their whole strategy has been, we're not going to bait the troll. We think they don't even want to call him a troll in any way that would go back to them. But effectively, they don't want to get into a war of words. They've done it before. They came to regret it pretty quickly. If you think about the time of the Southport riots, that was the first time I think there was a real fracas between the two. So we're not going to engage directly, but we're going to talk about Keir Starmer's record as DPP and so forth. But then the question came up about Jess Phillips, who, of course, Elon Musk has been saying deserves to go to jail. There's lots of worry on the Labour side about, her own personal safety as a result of that. And that's when Keir Starmer had this impassioned defence. But in their mind, even though that's still quite clearly becoming about Elon Musk saying things and accusing him, I feel there's a slight, amongst some supporters of Keir Starmer, confusion as to why this is now Keir Starmer versus Elon Musk, because they don't want to get into this straight fight, but they also don't want to completely ignore it. And it does mean it all feels a bit muddled in terms of what's coming from 10 Downing Street at the moment.
On the topic of conversations Labour would probably rather we ignored, Kate Andrews spoke to the economist Julian Jessup about Rachel Reeves' disastrous handling of the economy and whether or not she really is worse than Liz Truss.
So, Julian, the government started off the new year with a new host of problems, mainly the wrath of Elon Musk. But just because it has new problems doesn't mean that the old problems have gone away. And among the mudslinging that's been happening back and forth across the pond, there have been some pretty worrying indicators when it comes to borrowing costs. Can you tell us about these market jitters?
Yes, well, in short, there's a crisis in the bond market. So government bond yields, which are basically the cost of government borrowing, have shot up. They've been rising for a number of months now, but in the last few weeks, they've hit some important milestones. So, for example, the cost of very long-term borrowing for the UK government is now at its highest since something like 1998. So this is a very, very big move. And it's definitely something to worry about. I mean, not only, of course, is it the cost of borrowing for the government at a time when the budget is already under pressure, but it also sets the benchmark for lots of other forms of borrowing in the rest of the economy, in the private sector. So it's making it more expensive for companies and for households to borrow as well.
And gilt yields, whilst all very technical, did become somewhat of a household phrase over the past couple of years, really starting with the mini budget when they started to move quite dramatically and coming up to present day. Let's explain for some of our viewers who may not be as familiar, however, just how important this is and just how much it does impact our daily lives, because the cost of borrowing for the government has an impact on interest rates and what the Bank of England decides to do. It has an impact on what the government can spend. It has an impact on whether or not the Chancellor is meeting her own fiscal rules. Can you speak a little bit about the real impact of what happens when borrowing costs start to spike?
Well, I can give you one particular number. So suppose that long-term interest rates, in other words, government bond yields, rise by 1%. So that's an increase from, say, 4% to 5%, which is roughly what we've seen so far this year. Then that will add close to £12 billion a year to government borrowing because of the increase in debt interest payments. Now, at the moment, there is headroom of about £12 billion a year in the government's forecasts. So basically, this increase in interest rates has wiped out any room for manoeuvre that the Chancellor might have on tax or spending. So if anything else goes wrong, or if interest rates continue to rise, then there's going to be yet another black hole in the public finances that has to be filled, whether that's through more tax increases or spending cuts or something else. So this is yet another reason to be concerned that the economy is already slowing, but we may still not have seen the full impact of tax rises because, in fact, there might have to be more to come.
And what is so painful is that these borrowing costs, these debt servicing payments, are paying off money that's already been spent, right? You don't get anything new for this money. You don't get new hospitals. You don't get more doctors or nurses. You're paying off what's being borrowed. And that makes it all the more painful as well, because when you talk about such staggering figures there, like £12 billion, when you think about what that could actually do in terms of public services or in terms of a tax cut, you could be taking a penny or more off income tax with that kind of money. Instead, it's just paying off what's already been spent.
Well, that's exactly right. If you look at it in other ways, the government has extended VAT to private school fees, which is supposed to raise, say, $2 billion to pay for extra teachers in the state sector. I mean, lots of question marks about those numbers, but that's $2 billion for more teachers in state schools compared to $12 billion that we're having to pay out potentially in higher debt interest, and that debt interest is basically lost. Obviously, it's great if you're a holder of a government bond who's getting more interest than before, but those are not necessarily the people we want to be helping at the moment.
Right. That context is so important, I think, for the conversation that we're about to have. So let's pull up some of those graphs here. We have the long-term borrowing cost, as you said, reaching levels not seen since 1998. But we also see here on the 10-year gilt yields, those have now surpassed the peak of where they landed after the Liz Truss mini budget. Now, Julian, you were advising the former Prime Minister during the leadership election in the lead up to when she became Prime Minister. You have written for The Spectator and elsewhere that you were not a part of the decisions that were made after. But one of the crucial breaking points really for Liz Truss was the fact that after she announced that mini budget, investors looked at it and thought, gosh, we're not terribly confident about this. We're going to demand a higher return if we're going to invest in the UK. Is the same thing happening now? Is it a fair comparison to make?
Well, I think it's a good comparison to make, in that there are some similarities and some differences. I mean, the obvious similarity is that yields have risen very sharply, and I think both the mini budget in 2022 and Rachel Reeves' more recent budget have played a part in that. On the plus side for Liz Truss, the budget, her mini budget, actually went quite well with businesses. Businesses welcomed it because it included tax cuts, including cuts in corporation tax. So that budget was, potentially good for the economy, whereas I think most people accept that this budget, in the short term at least, is having a negative effect. So if you're going to argue about who crashed the economy, I think it's far more reasonable to point the finger at Rachel Reeves than it is to Liz Truss. On the other side, the rise in bond yields in the wake of the mini budget in 2022 was much more abrupt. It was much more disruptive, and the mortgage market in particular was hit very hard. But even that, wasn't really just down to Liz Truss. There's also the problem that, the technical problem in the bond market to do with what's called liability-driven investment strategies. Very, very complicated, but basically there was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And I think that's more the fault of the regulators, particularly the Bank of England, than it was Liz Truss herself. So there are some similarities and some differences. But if I were Liz Truss now, and I know she's actually doing this, she'd be quite rightly saying, well, look, you're accusing me of crashing the economy in 2022. But in many ways, things are actually a lot worse now. Interest rates are higher, and the economy is actually weakening sharply.
There will be some viewers who will listen to you saying that the mini budget was arguably better for the economy, who will very much disagree. Perhaps one of the fair comparisons to make, which doesn't reflect terribly well on Liz Truss or what this Labour government has done in its first budget, is that it is clearly not a great time to be asking the markets to borrow tens of billions more pounds, and yet both governments are attempting to do it. And there has been serious pushback in both cases, and that pushback translates to tougher times for voters.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Yes, no, I think it's important to stress here that this is a global phenomenon. It's not just in the UK that bond yields are rising sharply. They're also rising sharply in the US. In the US, for example, long-term government bond yields are now basically their highest since 2008, which was the global financial crisis. So this is happening in many places. To some extent, it's just a return of interest rates towards more sort of normal and healthy levels. So this was something that was going to happen at some point. But it has happened a bit sooner than most people expected. And that's partly because of worries about the enormous amount of government debt that investors are going to be expected to buy. So obviously they're demanding a higher interest rate to take on all that new issuance that's coming on the pipeline. But it's also new concerns about inflation. And the US actually is arguably a bigger problem here in many ways than the UK, because we've got the Trump presidency 2.0 coming soon. He is planning to, cut taxes, borrow more money, impose tariffs on imports, lots of things that might be inflationary and mean that the US budget deficit remains very high. So that is also therefore having a spillover effect in other countries. If you look at UK and US government bond yields, they're now tracking each other very, very closely. The difference, though, of course, is that the US economy is strong, ours is weak. So we should really have interest rates that are closer to the levels in the Eurozone, where economies are also struggling, rather than those in the US. So there's definitely something local happening in the UK too. And that's essentially the fallout from the budget.
Yeah, I did see that you had written on X that Donald Trump is arguably just as much to blame as Rachel Reeves for this bond market jitter. I wonder, the U.S., for plenty of reasons, including the fact that it's the reserve currency, can get away with borrowing a lot more. But this is really the crux of it, isn't it? That from Liz Truss to this new Labour government, nobody really wants to deal with the spending side of the ledger. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng said that's to come. You're going to see the fiscal prudence down the line. Labour have suggested you're going to see it in the spending review, that is also to come. I guess the main difference, perhaps the reason that this has been sort of a longer process for Labour to see this rise in borrowing costs, is partially that they did implement such significant tax hikes. It was a signal, a very painful signal, to the market that they were going to try to account for some of this money that they wanted to spend. Liz Truss, of course, was cutting tax at the same time that she was asking to borrow so much money. But is the issue here just that markets have realized post-COVID, when we had this huge spending spree across the world, nobody really wants to change their habits?
Yes, I mean, you can probably get away with what governments are doing now if debt was, say, 60% of national income, which used to be considered a sort of a reasonable threshold. But in most countries, including the UK and also the US, debt is close to or above 100% of national income. So we're starting from a point where debt is already very high. On top of that, the state has got more involved in the economy in all sorts of ways, and Labour seems to be keen on doing even more of this in areas like labour markets and education and energy policy and so on. So the state is already very big, and the Labour government is planning to make it even bigger. I mean, one way to look at this, if you go back to the budget, then broadly speaking, the plan was to transfer another 2% of national income from the private sector to the public sector. And that was in the form of about 1% worth of tax increases and about a 1% increase in borrowing, which largely comes from future taxpayers, as you suggested earlier. So that's another big shift away from the private sector to the public sector at a time when the tax burden is already at a record high and when productivity, particularly in public services, is relatively low. So that was bound to disrupt the economy and unsettle the markets. In terms of specific concerns, investors in bond markets are worried about a number of things. So one is that all that increased spending is just going to add to inflation, and therefore the Bank of England will be slower to cut interest rates than it might otherwise have been. There also worries that those big increases in tax are going to slow the economy, potentially even cause a recession. So you don't end up raising anywhere near as much tax revenue as anticipated, and therefore taxes have to go up again. And finally, there's the sort of increase in borrowing, as you say, at a time when investors around the world are already having to buy a lot of government bonds. Here's even more that they're going to have to buy in order to fund big increases in public investment in the UK. So I think it isn't just the global backdrop. There's definitely big upward pressure on bond yields coming from the budget decisions as well.
Julian, I want to pick you up on this point about inflation because it is a terrifying prospect that we could be looking at another price spiral, especially after what happened post-COVID over the last few years. Nobody seems to be predicting that anything like that would happen again. But it doesn't take inflation ticking up much for the Bank of England to start making different decisions about whether or not they're going to cut interest rates. It could still have quite an impact. And if inflation ticks up, that leads us closer and closer to that dreaded word stagnation, where you don't have an economy that's growing, you have inflation higher than you'd like it to be, and very worryingly, you might have rising unemployment. Now, that last point is something that the UK has actually been able to avoid for a very, very long time, but you think there might be some factors that could see that number start to tick up.
Yes, well, I like to try and be optimistic, so I'll start with a few positive points.
Great.
First of all, I don't think inflation is actually going to rise very far. I think it will peak maybe actually slightly below 3% in the early part of this year. So remember, inflation was in double digits, more than 10% during the worst of the energy crisis in particular. So I don't think inflation is going to rise much further. I also think that over the next year or so, incomes are still likely to rise more quickly than prices. So most households are still going to see an increase in their purchasing power, even if inflation picks up. And then finally, as far as the Bank of England is concerned, they have actually signalled that they might be willing to continue cutting rates, even if inflation picks up, because they are getting more concerned about the downside risks to growth than they are about a temporary pickup in inflation. So I think there are some reasons to be optimistic. My worry, though, as you implied, was what's happening in the labour market. The labour market has definitely started to cool. So part of the fallout from the budget is that companies are much more worried about the outlook for the economy, but they're also freezing hiring and in some cases looking at making job cuts. Remember, they've been hit not just by the increase in employers' national insurance, but also many companies, particularly in sectors like retail and hospitality, are going to have to pay much higher wages from April this year as a result of the big increase in the national minimum wage. So the labour market is definitely cooling. Again, that might have a silver lining that it makes it more likely the Bank of England will keep cutting interest rates. But I think we will see a steady rise in unemployment over the course of this year. You're right also to refer to stagflation. So that's the sort of toxic combination of weak or falling activity, rising inflation and higher unemployment. I think we will see that, but it'll be relatively mild compared to what we've had before. So back in the 1970s, we had a deep recession, inflation of 10% or more, unemployment of close to 10% as well. I think what we'll see this time is a shallow recession, a modest pickup in inflation, and a relatively small rise in unemployment. So it's what I call stagflation light. But that's far short of what's needed to repair the public finances. So the Office for Budget Responsibility was assuming 2% growth this year. I think we'll be lucky to get 1%. We might even get slower growth this year than we got over 2024 as a whole. So stagflation light is not a disaster, but it's still much, much weaker than what we need.
And let's pull up the growth chart, the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility that they publish alongside the budget. As you just said there, Julian, you are not personally expecting for all of these figures to be met. In fact, the UK could really underwhelm, and you're not the only economist saying that at the moment. And I just wonder the extent to which you think growth is really at the heart of every issue in the UK right now. Yes, there are major problems. The size of the national debt, the regulation strangulation of building more homes. There are plenty of things that need to be addressed. But if you had robust growth in the UK, a lot of these issues would become easier, and some of them could borderline disappear. I mean, to what extent is the stagnation in terms of economic growth really what's holding Britain back?
Well, making the comparison again here between Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves. So Liz Truss made the mistake of announcing big cuts in tax before she'd really addressed the spending side or made the structural reforms that are necessary to to boost growth. One thing, though, that she could have done worse than that was to raise tax before making the spending cuts and before doing the structural reforms. And that's the bigger mistake that I think that Rachel Reeves has made. So the economy already wasn't looking great before Labour took over. But the first thing that Labour has done is to knock it to the floor. Business confidence in particular has tanked in the wake of the budget. So we're starting from a very poor position. If there is hope, it does lie in structural reform. And to be fair, Rachel Reeves has talked a good talk here about things like planning reform and fixing the pension system and more infrastructure spending, deregulation in some areas, tackling the crisis in the NHS, those sorts of things. So they certainly made lots of the right noises, but if you sort of dig beyond the headlines, the progress has been slow. The plan to fix the NHS is faltering. Planning reforms are still running into loads and loads of NIMBYism. There's questions about whether construction firms actually have the workers or the materials to build 1.5 million houses. And in lots of areas, of course, the new government is planning to increase regulation, particularly in the labour market, not just the big increase in national minimum wage, but also employment rights, which are great for people who do keep their job, but more rights mean more obligations, and as a result, employers may be less willing to hire. So we've got mixed signals at the moment, and the government doesn't really have the confidence of the markets here. The markets don't really trust the long-term growth agenda, so they're worried that all we're seeing is tax increases leading to the dreaded doom loop of a weaker economy, falling confidence, rising borrowing costs, more tax increases, and they'll start all over again.
Well, there have been whispers, or frankly something louder than a whisper, about the possibility that Labour will have to do another round of significant tax hikes if borrowing costs even just stay where they are now, but certainly if they keep rising and if growth remains really unremarkable, nothing to write home about, unless they are willing to slash a lot of public spending, and we haven't seen evidence of that yet. That last lever that Rachel Reeves might have to pull is another tax hike. She has been rather insistent that she doesn't want to or won't, but that hasn't been the message from the rest of the Labour government.
Well, the first thing, I think that Rachel Reeves' comments here have essentially zero credibility. In the run-up to the election, she was saying that there was no need to raise taxes, and then when she did raise taxes, she tried to claim that employers' national insurance somehow isn't a tax on workers. So I think she has very little credibility here. The second point, though, to make is that I don't think tax increases are guaranteed. Remember that the way that the budget works is it all really depends on what the Office of Budget Responsibility is assuming is going to happen in the fifth year of the forecast horizon. So you can actually have quite a lot of bad news in, say, years 1 and 2, as long as the OBR is more optimistic about what happens at the end of that period. And it's possible, for example, that the OBR might start to say something like, well, there's been this big increase in public investment, and that will have a bigger impact on growth than we anticipated. Now we know a bit more about the detail of it. So I wouldn't say that tax increases are baked in. But I do think they're more likely than not. I think that's clearly the way that we're heading, given the weakness of growth and other pressures, including higher interest rates. So the question is, where will the axe fall? I suspect that there will be another round of tax increases, probably focused on getting rid of some more of the sort of tax reliefs and exemptions, for example, on pensions that so far haven't been touched. But there are a few other things the government might do that would be less painful. I think one thing they will be looking at is reducing the amount of interest that the Bank of England has to pay to commercial banks on the reserves that have been created over the last few years as part of quantitative easing. You could probably save 10 to 20 billion a year, either by reducing that interest rate or imposing some sort of tax on the banks. That won't be painless, because that tax will be passed on to borrowers in one form or another, but that might be preferable to some of the alternatives, including further increases in, for example, employers' national insurance or other things that they might do on personal taxes.
Well, Julian, let me end by asking you whether or not you think the economy is crashing this week. That has been the phrase that has been levied at the Liz Truss administration, and that Labour very much liked to use during the campaign, and now that the economy crashed when borrowing costs started to surge and when the forecast for interest rates also started to surge. Now that we have come parallel or actually surpassed borrowing costs since Labour's first budget, is the economy crashing, or is that completely the wrong way to talk about what's really going on?
No, I think it's fair in this case. I think you can say the economy is crashing in two ways. I mean, first of all, growth has collapsed. In the first half of last year, growth was pretty strong. We were at pretty much at the top of the league table for growth amongst the G7 group of advanced economies. But by the end of last year, we're going to be pretty much at the bottom. So, other economies are slowing, particularly Germany and France. But, our turnaround has been much more dramatic. And undoubtedly, that's at least partly a result of what the government has done on the budget and other things. The other sense in which you can say the economy is crashing is if you look at business confidence, which has plummeted over the summer, but particularly since the budget. So businesses are much more worried about the outlook for the economy than they were before.
Consumer confidence was not terribly high after the mini budget, and when people were seeing what was going to happen to their mortgages. Are we slightly at risk of cherry picking this phrase when it suits? I mean, I wonder if the real wake up call here is the national debt and the fact that you're looking at so many problems down the line if you can't get your spending and your borrowing under control. In both circumstances, perhaps that could be highlighted, and it's still the topic nobody wants to talk about.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's rather worrying to think that we've got the budget behind us, but that's only part of what Labour's going to have to do to fix the public finances. They also need to have this big spending review, which is going to take place over the spring. And rather like with tax, they sort of tied their hands by saying that, no, we're not going to raise certain taxes, which forced them to make even bigger increases in others. With spending, they've protected certain budgets. So they promised all this extra money to the NHS with no real certainty that's going to produce an improvement in the quality of services being delivered. But in protecting the NHS and certain other departments, they're putting the squeeze on so-called unprotected budgets. And those are some areas where, even me as a sort of, small state free marketeer, I would be worried. So these are things like the criminal justice system and defence, things that, can't really be left to the markets to sort out, where the government has to be active. And I don't think we can afford to cut any more from criminal justice. And if anything, we should be increasing the defence budget. So we've had one shoe land, which has been the budget with the tax increases in that. But there's potentially another, which is a tough spending review with some very difficult choices in it that may not end up being the right ones.
Next up, do we need a public inquiry into grooming or raping gangs? This has been an ongoing point in British debate this week. And Natasha Feroz is joined by Raja Miah, who is an anti-grooming campaigner, to discuss it.
Now, Raja, I'd like to come to you first. Thank you for joining us. Why do you want there to be a government-led public inquiry into grooming gangs?
I think for us in Oldham, it's a quest for truth and it's a quest for justice. And we've looked at what's happened in the past, particularly with the grooming gangs. And the campaigns in the main have been led by survivors or people who are inexperienced in navigating this. Now, for us to get this far, and yesterday, whilst the vote was a disappointment, what you've got to understand is I take it as a victory, and the people who've campaigned take it as a victory. Now it is now in the national discourse that the term Pakistani heritage rape gang, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, stood up in Parliament and used those exact words. We were being branded as racist and far-right campaigners when we used those words when we were campaigning, because the children we were speaking to were groomed and gang raped by that demographic, and we were told we can't say that. The Home Secretary now says that. So I look at yesterday and I take it as a victory on a campaign towards a public inquiry, and it's another step closer we've got. Now, the reason why is because there have been inquiries in the past, investigations in the past, and it was Jess Phillips who wrote back to Oldham to say no, and you can have a local-based one. because every time they've tried to shift us to a place of a local inquiry, and a local inquiry can't get to the truth. It's as simple as that. It doesn't mean that the public inquiry will get to the truth, but we know that every local-based inquiry hasn't got to the truth. The local-based inquiries rely on those who are being investigated to provide the evidence that they're going to be investigated on. And local-based inquiries also rely on people of their goodwill to give testimony. You know, you can't call witnesses. And we got here off the back of a 6-year campaign where we removed 3 Labour Party leaders in the town in succession. Through the ballot box, through campaigning, we removed Sean Fielding, leader of Oldham Council, Arud Shah, leader of Oldham Council, Amanda Chadderton, leader of Oldham Council. All 3 of them, coincidentally, were then rewarded by the Labour Party for the loyalty in blocking our campaign. So Sean Fielding is now a councillor in Bolton. Arud Shah is now, as well as the leader of Oldham Council again, she's the chair of the National Constitutional Committee of the Labour Party. And Amanda Chadderton shamelessly went on, after we removed her, went on to work for Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, as a campaign manager. So there's something far more sinister going on here. And a public inquiry will not just expose what happened to these children and who failed them. A public inquiry will expose those who were complicit in the cover-up. And that is what yesterday brought. And that's the culmination of a 6-year campaign that we've been leading from a small northern town. A very political campaign. You know, we come at this from a very different place. We are political campaigners. This is a politically educated town, and this is a town that has took the Labour Party, at the height of the Labour Party, they had 47 councillors controlling this council. They now run a minority administration with 27 councillors, and they were forced with the independent councillors that we had elected to enter into a pact to write to the government. And we knew they'd say no, and we wanted them to say no, but what we wanted was in Parliament this conversation to take place where the world now knows what has gone on. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, talked about systemic failures. She talked about the industrial scale grooming and gang rape of children across the country. The world now knows that we are not the far-right campaigners that they portrayed us to be. We are decent, working-class people from a town that cares about its children and wants this cover-up blown up and those responsible held to account. And that is why we want a public inquiry.
And Raja, out of interest, what did you think of the previous inquiry chaired by Alexis Jay? Because since there has been all this calls for a government-led inquiry, she said, well, her independent inquiry, if everyone just learnt the lessons from what she exposed in her report, then that's actually what the victims want. They don't want another inquiry. What do you make of that?
The Jay report, and I have nothing but admiration for Alexis Jay, particularly from the previous work in Rotherham and what that exposed. The ICSA report, I think is what you're referring to, the ICSA inquiry, did not look at the grooming gangs. It was a footnote. I think it was like a paragraph, you know. So 7 years and it's a paragraph. And there's something else of significance in that. Telford, and there was a judge-led Telford inquiry afterwards, you know, and more recently, a judge-led Telford inquiry only took place because Telford had been removed or not selected as one of the case studies for that ICSA report. So the Telford inquiry only took place because it was not selected as part of the ICSA case studies. And if you look at the Alexis Jay report, there's like a paragraph or something in terms of the grooming gangs. And the grooming gangs are something very specific. Natasha, the grooming gangs are something very specific. And they deserve investigating. Now, this is not to get away from Alexis Jay's very thorough, you know, national inquiry that took place, the national investigation that took place over 7 years. But we have not looked at this case, and this case specifically, we now know. Well, no one says numbers, do they? You know, is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 100,000? Is it more? No one will dare say numbers. So the best thing I'll say is countless working class white girls from across the country were systematically groomed and gang raped by predominantly Pakistani heritage men over decades in this country. And we cannot launch an inquiry to investigate what happened. What sort of country is this?
Isabel, I want to bring you in here. You have, and I want to broaden this topic out beyond the grooming gang scandal. You've covered several inquiries in your time. Most recently, we've had the post office inquiry. We've also had the COVID inquiry last year. What do you think is the point of inquiries, and which are the ones that have worked and which are the ones that haven't?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at the anatomy of a government response to calls for an inquiry and then the inquiry once it is published, because it tends to be entirely the same regardless of party. So one of the inquiries that I've covered in quite a lot of detail was the Mid-Staffs inquiry, which was led by Robert Francis KC. And the government really resisted for a long time the calls for the inquiry and then the calls for it to be a statutory public inquiry. And you see that again and again with different scandals where initially campaigners are sort of given their inquiry. But as Raja said, that local inquiry, for instance, doesn't have the power to summon witnesses to give evidence under oath. And so you can end up with a very piecemeal picture of what actually happened. And therefore, a lack of accountability for what has gone wrong. So ministers tend to delay making the inquiry as powerful as possible. Now, there are some good reasons for that, which is that public inquiries do take a long time and they're quite costly. But once the public inquiry is granted, politicians tend to think, right, we've done that now. That means we've learnt the lessons and we don't have to think about this anymore. It's not going to be raised in the Commons. No one's going to give us grief about it at press conferences because we can just say, well, there's a public inquiry. We've set up a public inquiry. 7 years later, by which time most of them have exited the scene, at least front bench politics, the inquiry publishes. And again, there's a flurry of interest. People give press conferences. I'm thinking now particularly actually of the Chilcot inquiry, which again, took a very long time, cost a huge amount of money. I sat in what's known as the lock-in for Chilcot when it eventually reported, where we were given, I think it was about 2.5 hours as journalists to read the embargoed documents. Now, I mean, there are like 12 volumes of the Chilcot report. So we were all desperately thumbing through the executive summary, which in itself was about the size of, I wouldn't say War and Peace, but it wasn't a small document itself. We reported on it. Tony Blair gave one of his many press conferences where he ruminated about Iraq, having obviously left government. Conservatives were in government by this point. And then everyone moved on. The next day, the news agenda was about something else. And a few people continued to read their way through the Iraq War Inquiry report. A few people had a look at what the recommendations were. In terms of political salience and the political narrative, nobody was talking even a week later about what those lessons were that governments needed to implement, despite the fact that military intervention is not a one-off thing that just happened with Iraq.
Yeah.
Despite the fact, actually, in the intervening years, we had an intervention in Libya, which had exhibited some of the same failures, particularly in terms of post-conflict planning, as Iraq. So governments were manifestly not learning lessons in the intervening period. They had a chance to learn those lessons again, weren't implemented. Another example of this, which is particularly troubling, I think, is the Harold Shipman inquiry. Now, this was a very long time ago, but it was only last year, 2024, that the government announced measures on an independent reviewer of death certificates that were recommended in the Shipman inquiry, which concluded, I think, in about 2002. And the victims of those crimes, the families whose parents were killed by Harold Shipman, had been campaigning for years. And actually, one of the things that I find particularly egregious about this is that you put people through a public inquiry, which is not a small ask. It's the same as asking somebody who has been, and particularly pertinent in this case, in Oldham and other grooming gang cases, you are asking someone who has been raped to relive their trauma. Or you are asking somebody who saw their neighbours burned to death in Grenfell to relive their trauma. Not just when they give evidence, but when the whole inquiry is going on. Other people are telling stories that chime with their experience. People who they know, who were in the police, who ignored them, are giving evidence. All of that is hugely re-traumatizing. That has a point if it then leads to people being held accountable and lessons being learned and governments actually implementing those lessons. If you then have a 10-year delay in some of those lessons being implemented, then that is a real failure of the victims, of people you've asked to step up. And so really, I think it's not so much the question, are public inquiries worth it? It's, does Westminster have the mechanisms and culture, firstly, to set them up properly, and secondly, to do anything about them once they report? So it always comes back to the culture in Westminster.
Of course. And Isabel, just following up from that, do you think part of the problem is this obsession with individuals when an inquiry looks back on a crisis? I'm thinking specifically about the COVID inquiry, and there was hours spent looking at the way Dominic Cummings would speak to colleagues over WhatsApp, and they'd say, is this an appropriate use of language, when there were so many bigger topics to explore?
Yeah, I mean, partly because as humans, we all find that kind of stuff much more tangible than talking about, number of ventilators, number of beds, Nightingale hospitals, and that sort of thing. But also, I think, again, it is a Westminster problem, which is that we are so obsessed with dynamics within Westminster, and they are important. The dynamics of the Blair-Brown government are essential to understanding how that project failed or succeeded, and what happened in terms of big decisions on spending. But they're not the only thing. And we do not have the attention spans as a political class to pay decent attention to proper questions of policy. And I think that's, one of the reasons why we've ended up in this bizarre situation in the past week, where nothing has actually changed materially for victims in the past week. It's just that some powerful people who other people in Westminster pay attention to started firing off some tweets. Now that's, overall that is to the benefit of victims, but is that really the system that we want? Is that, do we really want politics to be this sort of pinball of, we've got to pay attention to this, or we've got to make an urgent response to that, as opposed to, and this comes back to, what do you do once a public inquiry reports? You actually have to do quite a lot of plodding work that no one's going to pay attention to. And I think the fact that Yvette Cooper sort of, rushed to the Commons on Monday to announce that the government was implementing some of the ICSA recommendations showed that we are stuck in this kind of pinball machine, because I suspect next week we will be talking about something entirely different. And that, again, will be led by the people who people pay attention to in Westminster. And that's very rarely white working class victims of rape. It's very rarely tenants stuck in a tower block where they're worried about the fire safety.
And Raja, could you tell me a little bit about what you expect would be the best end result after a public inquiry? I think it might be fair to say that you have lost faith in government institutions and the council, perhaps. And so I'm interested to hear, why do you think that a public inquiry could achieve what you want, having been let down by the public institutions themselves so much?
Because I've seen in parts of the world what happens when democracy breaks down. And people need to understand, in the places I come from, in the towns and cities where there is this working class, underclass, this demonization of our people, of our communities, this is what we are on the brink of. And August was an indicator of what may happen and will be worse if we do not rebuild trust in the very institutions that are the foundations of our society, of our democracy. We want to elect politicians who represent us, who are our voice. We want the systems and processes to take care of those who are the most vulnerable. And all of that has broken down in this. And for that to be repaired, a public inquiry will not just expose those who failed these children. It's not just about holding them to account. There's something far deeper taking place in which the very fabric of our democracy has been undermined in towns such as mine. And so I don't want to be rude to any of you, but you need to understand something very clearly. And it is only because of people like me and brave councillors in that council chamber that people have not rioted on the street, because we are desperately saying to our people, we will fix this through the right and proper way. There is no need to go out onto the streets and start attacking mosques, start blowing up buildings. There is no need for that. We will fix this through the right and proper way, because if we don't fix it this way, which way are we going to fix it?
What would be your reaction, Raja, to, Reform? The Reform Party have said if Labour don't go ahead with this government-led inquiry, we're going to do our own. Would you endorse that?
I think, with the greatest of respect to Reform, they are very new in this, and they haven't quite understood what they can do and what they can't do. And what if they set about doing something that then can't deliver, what will happen to those survivors and those communities who've put their faith in them? So I have contacted Richard Tice. I've spoken with Rupert Lowe. I'm desperately pleading with them. Please pause and take some time to understand what the processes in this democracy are, how we can go about them, rather than making promises and taking people down a road where then that you will also fail them.
And lastly, Isabel, what do you think about sort of maybe there's a new process of less traditional routes of having public inquiries? For example, the Reform Party holding their own public inquiry. I think it sometimes seems like the media holds its own public inquiry. Do you think we're moving away from £100 million a year spent for the last decade on public inquiries, and there's going to be slightly different sort of trial by media, trial by different political parties?
I mean, I hope not, but it is difficult to look at the current inquiry system and to say this is the silver bullet. And I don't, that obviously Raja's not suggesting that in any way at all. And I think what everyone wants is a more agile inquiry system with greater power after reporting to enforce the recommendations it has made. There are currently, no parliamentary mechanisms for following up public inquiries. And it's something that sort of serious parliamentarians are quite concerned about and are hoping to try to rectify through the select committee system and so on. As I said, I'm not entirely sure that the media is particularly helpful in this, particularly the political media, because we're generalists and we are experts in the parties and in the dynamics between, who hates who in Number 10, which is important. But I think that often comes at the expense of our policy colleagues who actually understand what is going on in terms of structures, local authorities, policing, and so on. And, perhaps I shouldn't argue this because it sounds quite self-loathing, but I think we should be less important and that our policy colleagues should be more important and I think the COVID press conferences really showed that, actually. I think, with all due respect to my political editor colleagues, not many of them seem to know very much about antibodies and antigens. And the questioning very quickly ended up being about, but Matt Hancock said this 2 weeks ago, do you disagree with him? As opposed to the detailed issues that were actually affecting NHS staff at the time, whether it be, bed capacity, ratios of staff, and so on. So I think we need to be careful as political journalists to remember what we can actually do and what we don't actually know that much about, and sort of back off and let the specialists do their jobs as well.
Penultimately, Donald Trump will be inaugurated for his second term in 8 days' time. And I spoke to the Financial Times' Gideon Rachman to talk about what he will do to the world. Donald Trump gave an extraordinary press conference at Mar-a-Lago, yet another extraordinary press conference at Mar-a-Lago, where he reiterated his desire to annex Greenland, Canada, to take back control of the Panama Canal, and also threatened Hamas that all hell will break loose if its Israeli hostages are not returned before his inauguration.
That all hell must be paid if they don't release the hostages.
You know what that means, don't you? Well, do I have to define it for you? Look, all hell will break out. If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is. And they should have given them back a long time. They should have never taken them. There should have never been the attack of October 7th. People forget that.
It was quite a striking moment in world politics, I would say. And I am delighted to be joined by Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times. The Financial Times is chief foreign correspondent. What is your actual title?
Foreign affairs commentator, but
foreign
anyway,
affairs.
I can.
A very important man.
Exactly.
A very important man.
That's the key point. Yep.
Gideon Rachman is a very important commentator in world affairs, and we are delighted to be joined by him here at the Spectator's office. Gideon, let's start with that press conference. What were your thoughts about it?
Well, very much like Trump is back in the sense that it reminded me of what the first term was like, in the sense of these constant surprises. And what, did he really say that? But then the second thing was that really nobody had seen this coming. I mean, a lot of the discussion of Trump's foreign policy was before the election and during the election was, what will he do about Ukraine? What will he do about China? And how will he resolve the tension between, the neo-isolationists or restrainers who want to kind of pull America back, and the primacists, the Mitch McConnell school, who say, no, America, if anything, should be even more assertive in the world. Those were, we thought, the contours of the debate. And yet suddenly you've got the focus on America's immediate neighborhood with what sound like outlandish proposals. Greenland, well, he did talk about buying it in the first term, so maybe we should have seen that one coming. But retaking the Panama Canal, and Canada turning into the 51st state, these are extraordinary proposals.
And the thing I didn't mention, of course, which is renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
Yeah.
But as you say, these are regional concerns for America.
Yeah.
So it is America acting more like a conventional power in some ways, historically, concerned about its neighborhood.
Yeah, it's kind of 19th century, really. It's saying we intend to dominate our region. We're going to forget about all this stuff about the rules-based order. It's going to be a power-based order. And in that sense, it's more sort of congenial to the Xi Jinping and Putin view of the world, which is we want to dominate our regions. That Putin wants to reestablish Russian influence in Eastern Europe. Xi wants to dominate East Asia. And America's saying, you know what, we're going to dominate our region. And he didn't actually talk in this particular context about Mexico, but you talk to people around Trump and they make very aggressive noises about Mexico, whether it's because of migration, because of drug production, etc. So you're going to see in America, if he sticks to this, that's really swinging the big stick in its neighborhood.
Well, that gets us on to Trump's America as a revisionist power, which is what you wrote about in an excellent piece you wrote about for the FT recently. But before we get on to that, I just want to ask you a bit about this idea that I've been reading a little bit about in recent days, which is something Dan Hannan suggested on Twitter to Elon Musk, a.k.a. the First Buddy, that America, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand could form a sort of free trade Anglosphere alliance with a military element to it. And Elon Musk replied, "Good idea." Have you? Do you sense this is is this a sort of Brexiteer fancy?
Well, it's an old idea. I mean, I remember once discussing this in the 1990s with a former owner of The Spectator, Conrad Black, who was pushing the whole idea of the Anglosphere. But, it certainly would be an idea that would be congenial to, a wing of the Conservative Party, but they're not in power right now. If there's a change in power in Canada, which looks like it's coming, maybe they would be more receptive to it. But the trouble is, the way that Trump goes about doing this is so aggressive that even the leader of I can never pronounce his last name, Pierre Poilievre, I think is how he pronounced it.
Poilievre, that's what I was saying.
Poilievre is the French name, but he's got an anglified version of it. But anyway, even he had to say, look, Canada's 51st state, never going to happen, because, if you're a conservative politician, you stick up for your country. And if your next door neighbor is saying, actually, we're going to, treating you with disrespect and saying, we're going to punish you, we're going to threaten you until you agree to this, it's not a very good way of doing this. So I think the Dan Hannan view would be, in a way, rather old-style comedy of English-speaking nations. We've got so much in common, history, common law, culture, etc., we're the natural partners rather than this partnership with the EU. And that's an old argument, may have something to it. But the way that Trump's going about it seems to me more like a takeover bid than a kind of alliance.
Yes, I suppose that is the obvious first tension, that for Brexiteers, it's very attractive, this idea of an Anglo-Union to replace the European Union.
Sure.
But Trump's language is very much about America, making America great again. It's not about some sort of new world order based on Anglosphere interest.
No, and it was interesting. So I was at a conference in Washington with some of the Trumpy people, and I made an argument that actually values do matter in foreign policy, and almost a Hannan-esque argument that there was not a coincidence that countries like Britain and America had found themselves on the same side. And I got quite a lot of pushback. They said, no, foreign policy is about interests, and we're going to stick up for our interests.
Yeah.
And in fact, on my own podcast, when I interviewed Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, he said that over the course of his career, whenever he had felt sort of been tempted by the sentimental view of US-UK relations, he would get a pretty firm reminder that this was about, it's transactional. And that was his view of it.
Yeah, I suppose that's always been the way the commentariat and the special relationship interact, is we forget sometimes that for America it often is just about interests. And we, for our interests, we attach a sentimental importance to it that the Americans don't.
And which Americans, of course. It depends. But all countries, to some extent, it's about interests. But obviously, and I think another thing that I think Trump said either in that press conference or subsequently has emerged is that one of the things that America wants Britain to do now is to take back a lot of the British prisoners, ISIS prisoners in Syria, including Shamima Begum, something like 250 of them, and saying, you've got to do this for us now. Again, that would be incredibly difficult for a British government to do. So I don't think it would be a buddy-buddy relationship of equals as conceived by Elon Musk or certainly by Trump.
And do you get any impression that Musk and Trump are talking about Britain as part of their sort of international plans? Because certainly Musk's, strange to a lot of people, preoccupation with Britain in the recent days suggests, he's even tweeted a pinned tweet at 7 a.m. on the same day as the Trump press conference. Should America liberate Britain from its tyrannical government?
Yes, that doesn't sound very friendly to me, but Musk's. If I were the British government, I'm sure they are extremely concerned about this. But they have to think very carefully about how you deal with it, and it's partly because we don't know whether Musk is speaking for himself or speaking for Trump, and the question, it would in a way be very good politics, I think, for Keir Starmer to take on Musk. I stand up for Britain, this foreign billionaire, who is he, etc. And maybe he'll do that. But if he does, he's got to think, am I antagonizing the entire United States, the incoming government? What am I putting at risk if I do that? And I think that the other thing is, well, what are Musk's intentions? And is he further right, actually, even than Trump? When he backs the AfD, for example, which he's doing this week, when even reform is too moderate for him, and he's saying, actually, Tommy Robinson's the guy I'm interested in. At what point does that become a threat to, our democracy?
Yeah, or to what extent is he the sort of useful extreme mouthpiece that Trump used to be on Twitter himself in 2016? I wonder.
But I suspect that he is showing more of an interest in the UK than Trump has ever shown. Trump was charmed by the Queen. He has his golf courses. He didn't think that much of Theresa May. He was always, actually, Farage was always his guy and the person he got on with. But one felt that, he was sort of mildly well-disposed to some elements of British politics, but it wasn't front and centre for him.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for Musk, for whatever reason, it's his obsession of the day. Now, I mean, if I were the Brits, I would hope that there's so much on Musk's plate, that eventually his interests will move off.
Yeah.
But if he's really intent on, as he sees it, winning the battle for Western civilization by changing the politics of Europe, Britain being part of it, Germany part of it, well, then, that really is a challenge.
Indeed. And it seems to be Trump and Musk both think of Britain as the motherland, and so it is quite important to them. But we, being British ourselves, are getting we're talking too much about Britain because we should be talking about the world.
Yeah.
Because that's, after all, what Donald Trump seems to be talking about. And in this fascinating piece I mentioned earlier, you talk about America under Trump becoming a revisionist power, just as China and Russia are revisionist powers. Can you unpack a little bit of what you mean? And you say it's puzzling on America's.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's puzzling because, the standard critique that the Russians and the Chinese made when the Americans talked about the rules-based order is, this is just hypocrisy. It's basically a world constructed to benefit the United States and its allies. And you could say the current institutions have been sponsored by America, the World Trade Organization, Clinton put his weight behind it, but going further back, the UN and so on, they're based in New York, after all. And yet, here you have a US president saying, you know what, the world as currently working works very badly for America, and we're going to overturn the apple cart, and most obviously on trade. We're going to impose tariffs on everybody, but particularly on China, but potentially a 10 to 20% tariff on the whole world. And again, you'd say, well, hang on, what exactly is your problem? America is the world's largest economy. It's been growing faster than everybody else. It's currently growing almost as fast as China, a much poorer country. It dominates tech, it dominates finance. So to what extent is it working so badly for the United States? That's why, in some respects, I find it puzzling. And yet, it clearly is a proposition that Trump was able to sell to the American electorate. And now he's in power, he's going to try and reorder the world, kind of rip up a lot of the old institutions, particularly on trade, but also, and potentially threateningly for America's allies, the relationship with US allies who he continually portrays as kind of freeloading on America, American security guarantees in Europe, but also in Asia. He said similar things about Japan, about South Korea. Now, you could have a fairly kind of benign view of that, where he's saying, actually, he's telling us to do what we need to do anyway, which is increase defense spending. America spends something like 3.5%, but most European countries, Britain's at 2.3, France is at 2, the Netherlands at 2, Poland's at 4.7, but they've got Russia right next door to them. And so we need to increase this spending. But if there's a more aggressive still version of that, where Trump actually says, you know what, in the end, I'm not really interested in defending Europe in the way that America used to. This is a commitment that's now outdated, dates back to, the 1950s. The world's moved on. We're going to concentrate on Panama and Greenland and our interests in, above all, blocking China. Then it's a really different set of questions for Europeans, particularly if it's combined with what looks like intervention in our domestic politics.
I see your point as your argument as to why it's puzzling in one sense. However, it also seems to me that it's a very natural response to the revisionist ambitions of China. Because after all, what Trump world will say is that there is supposed to be this international rules-based order, but for a long time, China has been taking great advantage of it and growing, not playing by the rules at all, and actually is becoming... This could soon be the world's dominant superpower, and this is a reaction to stop that, and we need to behave as a revisionist power in order to stop.
Indeed, I mean, and if the revisionism were kind of reserved for China, so we're going to bang this tariff on China, and if it means kind of reneging on the WTO, don't care. That's kind of compatible with a great power move, but within the normal mental structures we have of America leading the free world. But if he's simultaneously whacking Germany, the EU, Britain, etc., then that's a bit more puzzling. But we don't yet know how that's going to play out. And there are competing forces within, around for Trump's ear, and probably voices, in his own head about which direction to go. I think he's an improviser with some very strong instincts.
And a fair part of your piece is about tariffs, because, of course, this will be a conversation about tariffs in the next few years.
Yeah.
Trump thinks tariffs are actually a much better idea than anybody in the establishment is willing to accept.
Yeah.
Or the old establishment, Financial Times brain, if you like, is willing to accept. Do you ever think maybe sometimes he has a point?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, we'll see. In a way, it's such an old idea that we haven't really seen it play out. I think I spent too many years being indoctrinated The Economist to go that far. So no, I don't think it's a good idea. But I think that America can probably weather it better than, say, the UK, because America's a huge economy. So autarky is, high tariff walls are possibly more workable for the United States. They're self-sufficient in energy, the world's largest energy producers. They produce most of their own food, etc. But they are vulnerable in certain areas. They're trying to remedy their dependence on Taiwanese semiconductors, but they need them. And there are other things that they will need. But also, I think it does raise prices. There is, you can see the markets already beginning to think maybe we're going to have a new era of inflation in the United States. And I think over time it makes you less efficient. And I thought it was very interesting, actually. We're all looking at the Musk-Trump relationship, and are there tensions in there? When Milei of Argentina said he was going to slash tariffs, Musk tweeted, "Great idea."
Yeah.
So, is that a commentary on what Trump is planning?
Yes, I suppose the hope always, in many ways, with Trump and tariffs is that it's a negotiating tactic. But it may be somewhere in between the two, in that it's a negotiating tactic that he takes seriously, and that he wants to be in a position where he can grant dispensation. So the tariff applies to everyone, but he's in a position to grant dispensations to whoever asks him nicely, or whoever asks him in a way that benefits America.
Yeah, and obviously he sees it as a geopolitical tool as much as an economic tool. I mean, the initial argument was economic, protect industries, American jobs and all of that. But it just in recent days, when he was asked, well, would you attack Canada? He said, oh, no, but we'll use tariffs to put pressure on them.
Yeah.
And he said the same about Denmark. We'll use tariffs to put pressure on them. Now, tariffs, there is meant to be a legal structure behind them. You can't, I think, turn them on and off like a tap quite in that way. But sure, he's going to use them as a kind of cudgel, I think. But I also think there is a danger, then a geopolitical danger for America in that you begin to alienate allies. And also you look totally unreliable. So countries will, the BRICS, for example, are expanding. Indonesia joined this week. The EU's just signed a big trade deal with Mercosur, which is collectively the EU and Mercosur is about 20% of the world economy, 25%. And I think the biggest risk is there are voices in the EU saying, you know what, maybe we should make a deal with China. And I think a lot of what Biden was trying to do, and quite successfully, was to work on allies to get them to take an American line on China. And so you had von der Leyen talking about de-risking from China and so on. But if Trump punches the Europeans too hard in the face, there'll be voices, there already are voices saying, well, let's just do a deal with the Chinese. We need Chinese EVs and solar panels if we're going to get anywhere on the clean technology transition. The Chinese EVs are cheaper, actually, than Teslas. Let's go for it and get them to build factories in Europe. So I think that is, and if I were the Europeans and you're looking, wow, Trump's looking quite threatening towards us, we need leverage, you play the China.
Well, upsetting or not upsetting allies brings us neatly onto Ukraine. Which will be a very big issue early on for the Trump administration. There was a sort of, when the Ukraine war started and the Western response happened, there was quite a lot of hope that the West was galvanized now militarily, and quite a lot of hawkish excitement, I'd say, about that. I think a lot of that is gone now. And the question then is, does actually the world want Donald Trump to negotiate a peace? And perhaps commentators can blame him for rewarding Putin's aggression. But really, it's what everybody knows has to happen.
To some extent. Look, I mean, I think that, everybody should want peace. This is a war that's cost 1 million casualties, Russian and Ukrainian dead and wounded. I certainly don't resent his ambition to do that. The question is on what terms. I think the fear in Ukraine and in parts of Europe is that if it's a kind of peace that's sort of stop for now, and no guarantees for Ukraine that Russia would be back within a couple of years as they were back after the Crimean annexation. But, we don't know. Maybe you could just freeze it in place, and that wouldn't be a great result, but it would be better than... I think the vision of a Ukrainian victory, of Russia falling apart, which was this sort of real hawkish hope, and those hopes were probably at their peak when Prigozhin's rebellion was on, and people thought, wow, Putin might actually be toppled and a whole new future for Russia. I think that doesn't look likely anymore. And so to that extent, there is some convergence between where the Biden administration was moving and where Trump is moving. Even the Biden people were saying, we're hoping for a negotiation next year. But I think there are two big questions about it. First, I think the Biden people, although they hadn't resolved how to do this, did take seriously the idea that Ukraine needed some kind of security guarantee, whether it was NATO, whether it was European, whether it was simply stuffing Ukraine with weapons so that they could fight back next time. That was something they were thinking about. It's not clear to me that Trump does take that bit of it that seriously. But then I think probably the biggest flaw is it's not clear that Russia's interested. Russia may decide that Ukraine is slowly losing, and if they keep going, they can get what they were after initially.
Well, and that China and Russia perhaps agree that this war is bleeding Western power, it's bleeding Western resolve, and that the longer it carries on, the better for them.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what the Chinese really think about this? But there was a period, when I was last time I was in Kiev, when the Ukrainians were hoping that the Chinese would intervene and talk to the Russians and so on. And I have an American friend who sort of does these back channel talks where he goes off and talks to the Chinese and Russians. And I said, what are they saying? And he said, they really hate each other. He said they both are very suspicious of America, and that does bring them together. But they don't get on that well. That was an observation. I don't know whether it's true. So I don't know what China's real goal is, but I think that the one thing that does unite the Russians and the Chinese is that they want an end to the West-dominated world. And to that extent, China doesn't want to see a Russian defeat, and a weakened West is in its interest,
So they want to move towards multipolarity and away from American unipolarity, which is sort of what Trump is bringing them.
Yes, although, it's not clear to me that that's what the people around him want, because I think they can see some of the pitfalls of that. So there's a very strong school of thought around Trump that says, Russia's not the problem, China's the problem, and we have to concentrate on keeping China in its box. So Elbridge Colby, the guy they just appointed as basically chief strategist in the Pentagon, his whole argument has been, we got to pull our forces. We don't have forces to contain both Russia and China. The Europeans have got to look after Russia. We've got to pull our forces over to Asia, but not just to hand the place over to China. On the contrary, to bolster American power in the Pacific. And again, there's some continuities with what Biden was doing, albeit in a different way. But under Kurt Campbell, who was Deputy Secretary of State for a couple more days, that was the whole thrust of American policy.
And an argument that you make in this piece, or that you put forward, it's more of an analytical piece than an argumentative one, but is that China will feel emboldened to take Taiwan if Trump rewards Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
It's a possibility, certainly. I mean, again, there's You can argue back and forth. I've had friends who say, no, it's more complicated than that. But I think the sort of central assumption is that, sure, there is such a thing as a sort of global geopolitical mood. And I think the chaotic American and Allied withdrawal from Afghanistan may have contributed to Putin's sense that the West was weak and that he could move in Ukraine. And if Russia finally triumphs in Ukraine after the West has made this great song and dance, then maybe the Chinese will feel, well, the West really is in retreat. But they have to make their own calculations. Invading Taiwan is not simple. And it would also involve a kind of economic rupture, which would be incredibly damaging for both China and the US. So do they really want to do that? I mean, possibly. Unfortunately, in one parallel with Russia is that it's probably in one man's head. I mean, I think it was Putin personally who decided this was what they was going to do in Ukraine, and China is similarly centralized, and people are similarly trying to figure out, well, what does she want?
And I mean, all of them are unpredictable.
Yeah.
And perhaps Trump is the most unpredictable. So for China, particularly with Taiwan, it goes back to the usual argument you had about Trump a lot in the first term, which is that people just don't know what he's going to do, and that makes him very strong. Yes, although he is unpredictable, but he has said some things on Taiwan which suggest that he's not that interested in defending Taiwan. And again, I have a degree of sympathy with him. I mean, I like Taiwan. I think it's a marvelous place, and I think it could be a model for the future, of a democratic China. Is it worth fighting World War III over? Maybe not. Yeah. And perhaps the one thing that Trump is predictable about is he doesn't like wars. No, absolutely. Perhaps for humane reasons, but also for value destruction. It doesn't make much sense to him. But I mean, I think the thing is that I don't think even Western leaders, sort of current brand before Trump, knew for definite in their own minds if they'd fight over Taiwan. The point was to place the thought in Xi's head that we might. As some, one of the American strategists pointed to me, he said, Xi has told China, they seem very confident of this, Xi has told China, the Chinese military, to be ready to invade by 2027. And our goal is that when he gets to 2027, he looks at the military balance and says, too risky, can't do it. And again, an Australian strategist, when they were describing to me AUKUS and the whole, what these nuclear subs are for and so on, and I sort of expressed some disquiet and said, this kind of sounds like we're preparing for a massive war. And he said, nah, the point is to stop a war, not to start one, but it's deterrence. Yeah. And whether Trump's kind of erratic statements increase deterrence or decrease them, I don't know. Well, in your piece, you say there's sort of you outline 5 possible scenarios of what America First foreign policy might mean for the world. And they are, I can read them out. They are, and I'm going to ask you to go through them. They are, 1, new great power bargain. Yeah. How would that pan out? So that's some of what we've been talking about, where Trump says, you know what, actually, we're not going to try to be the unipolar power. We're going to give you a sphere of influence to some degree. Russia can dominate Eastern Europe. China will be more influential. But in return, I want something. And what would that thing be? Well, it would be peace, but it would also maybe be a much more kind of beneficial economic relationship with China, where they agreed to sort of buy huge amounts of American soybeans, maybe give concessions to American companies such as Tesla, who already actually operate a big plant in China. So that would be the kind of bargain where Trump uses threats as leverage, but there's a kind of an understanding with Putin and Xi. And there's some sense that, Trump often speaks of them as peers that he respects, that he has that at the back of his mind. And the big loser in that, it seems to me, would be Europe. Europe is not one of those great powers that is in the bargaining there. No, I think Europe would be a loser, and also potentially Japan, South Korea. If it's basically middle powers that get squeezed in that sort of great power bargain. But the trouble is, it's easier to describe than to implement, because
each of these countries would have a slightly different view of, well, what their sphere of influence would be. And at a certain stage, the Americans might say, well, no, we didn't mean that. For example, Chinese domination of Taiwan. Well, TSMC produces 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. No American president's going to say, fine, China can control that.
Well, the second scenario is war by accident.
Yeah.
I mean, presumably most listeners and viewers will be able to understand that. But, I mean, what would be the immediate trigger for that?
Well, I suppose it's an extension of what I'm talking about, that they think they're reaching a great power bargain, that Trump's, but that Trump's, the America's behavior is misinterpreted, that the Russians and the Chinese think they're being given a green light to do what they want. China does try to invade Taiwan, but they've got it wrong. America comes in, and you end up in a war because both sides misunderstand where they were. And to some extent, that may have been partly what happened with Ukraine, that Putin didn't anticipate the extent of Western opposition. He was correct to believe we wouldn't fight, but there was more pushback than he thought. So countries can miscalculate, and you could have a miscalculation that actually leads to war.
And then your third scenario is something that I think is sort of happening already, which is anarchy in a leaderless world.
Yeah.
Would you agree with me that that's sort of where we're drifting towards that?
Yeah, we're having more sort of failed states, I think. Sudan, where there are, I think, 11 million displaced people. Myanmar in Asia, which is turning into what Syria was, maybe still is, a place where the central government only controls about a third of the territory, and there are various groups that none of us can name, but fighting it out. But there are refugees, there's drugs, there are outside powers intervening, but not enough to actually restore order. And you'll maybe get more of that because America's lost its appetite, as has the West, for intervention after Afghanistan, after Iraq. China is not ready for it. Russia does, but in a very destructive way through Wagner. So yeah, I think that some of that is already happening.
And then your fourth one strikes me as dreamy slightly, globalization without America, because this would be the kind of brick hope that developing powers will be strong enough to have a sort of global economy without America controlling it. But, America is the driving force of global capitalism. Can that really happen?
Well, not completely without America, but more of it. So I pointed to the EU-Mercosur agreement. That's something. I think a closer EU-China relationship. And although you say it's dreamy, one should remember that there are more countries whose major trading partner is China than whose major trading partner is the United States.
Yeah.
So sitting in Europe, it seems dreamy. But if you're sitting in Southeast Asia, maybe it's kind of already happening.
Yeah, I said dreamy. Maybe I meant nightmare. Yeah, I think it's more nightmare.
Well, yeah. I think that it's nightmare if it's accompanied by an expansion of Chinese geopolitical and Russian geopolitical influence. If it's can be confined to what Osborne would have referred to as the golden age, where you just do a lot more trade, but it doesn't have political implications, maybe it's a way out.
Yes, I suppose the old conservative concerns about freedom would be, that would be the big concern, is that freedom would be diminished quite drastically in such a world.
Yes.
Freedom of speech and so on.
Well, that's if it does have political implications. If by trading with China, and I think it's a legitimate concern, you place yourself on the hook where they say, as in a way Elon Musk is saying, yeah, well, that's fine, but we actually don't like what you're doing, this newspaper article you published about us, so can you kind of do something about that? Then that is very concerning. But if you stop short of that, but you just have an expansion of trade, then it does mean that you're not going to push back against China about human rights inside China. But we don't do that much of it anyway. But maybe you expand economic relations with that. But I think the problem with that is, for certainly for Britain, maybe less for Asian countries, is that I don't think America would take it lying down. They wouldn't say, well, fine. They would get quite shirty about it.
Yes, yeah. Which brings us to the last scenario, which is America, dreamy for some, nightmare for others. America first succeeds.
Yeah.
What do you think the likelihood of that is? I suppose the argument there would be America really is in the bully pulpit.
Yeah.
America First can change the world to its own liking.
They have enormous power tools, no doubt about it. They've got the world's reserve currency. They're the world's leaders in tech. And they are the world's predominant military power and basically underpin the security arrangements of both Europe and Asia. And one of the reasons European countries, maybe the primary reasons European countries don't turn around and say something very rude to Donald Trump is they're acutely conscious of their continuing dependence on American security guarantees. So, he might be able to get a lot of what he wanted through, Biden attempted to do it through sweet-talking allies and saying, this is what the way we're going to counterbalance China is by rebuilding alliances. But Trump is going to say, we don't have time for these kinds of conversations. We're going to decide what we want to do, and you're going to come along with us. And maybe it'll work for a while.
If it did succeed, would you think that the liberal world order had ended?
It depends what's accompanied by it. But if it's if you have the collapse of NATO, the collapse of the World Trade Organization, and the US actively intervening in the elections of fellow democracies, then yes, I would.
But if it checks the ascent of China, if it means freedom of speech is protected, if it means that economies can thrive, Trump is pro-business, why would it be bad news?
Well, I don't think it's great if the world's richest man, who's also a close ally of the US president, is calling for the overthrow of the British government. Even China doesn't do that. Are we looking at the wrong place, in terms of us as a self-respecting democracy?
Well, he notably doesn't do it about China, of course.
Absolutely.
Elon Musk, which does tell you quite a lot, I think. But I think for a lot of Republicans, they would regard America First succeeding as a chance to save the world from a kind of descent into this anarchy that we were talking about, that is benefiting, or that has benefited, authoritarian states, revisionist powers, and tyranny.
Yeah, except that we're at a balanced. I don't think we're quite there yet. I actually don't think that Russia and China are yet at the point that they would like to be, which is dominating their regions. As Jake Sullivan said in an effort to defend Biden's record, he said, let's say as a thought experiment that America had decided to invade Canada. Maybe it will decide to invade, and that he's talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that 3 years in, the US had lost 700,000 troops. And was, at Manitoba and nowhere near, you wouldn't say that was a success. And similarly, actually, China, maybe we've reached peak China before they've taken over Hong Kong, but not Taiwan. The Chinese economy is in trouble. They've got a big demographic problem. And actually, another element of the whole America First succeeds scenario is possibly these punitive tariffs on China will really throw China into a crisis. Chinese economists have estimated it might knock 2% off their GDP growth from 5 to 3. That's not great for them. Yeah. I don't think that, put it this, we're kind of getting lost in various scenarios, but I don't think that it's necessary for America to strong arm its allies because the situation is so hopelessly lost with Russia and China that it's Trump's way or descent into tyranny. That's not the world I see.
Yeah, well, you conclude, I'm sure rightly, with this point that it's probably going to be some amalgam of all these scenarios.
Yeah.
And you quote the great Gramsci quote, but you do the full version, which is, because the second part is the key bit, I think. The old world is dying and the new world cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I hesitated and I thought, this is a terrible cliche. Can I really end on it?
But you did the full one.
But it did. I did put famous, cliched, quote by Gramsci, because it does seem very appropriate, actually. And it's interesting when he was writing. He was writing in 1929 as a world order was breaking down. And indeed, we did get quite a few morbid symptoms in the 1930s.
Things are cliches for a reason.
Yeah.
Gideon Rachman, thank you very much for coming to The Spectator.
Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, I'm afraid it's me again, but I am in conversation with Amy Wax, and we're talking about American education. Today, we are going to be talking about education in America, because Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida and the man who tried to beat Donald Trump in the Republican primaries and failed, has been implementing a classical education program in his state that is causing some controversy. A lot of liberals think it's dangerously conservative. A lot of conservatives think it's great. DeSantis has even introduced a classical literacy test. I think it's called the classical literacy test. I may be wrong. And that is going to be a rival to the SAT, the standard test for American students. To discuss this, I am delighted to be joined once again by Professor Amy Wax, who is still, despite her own controversies, a tenured professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. Amy, thank you very much for coming back on to Americano.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted you're here. First off, should we do a sort of simple thumbs up or thumbs down for Ron DeSantis' classical education program in Florida?
Well, I'm afraid I'll have to say both, because in my thinking about education as a general matter, because I am deeply involved in an aspect of education, I have decided that there really is an important distinction between so-called K through 12 education, which is kindergarten through high school, and university and professional education. And the reason is pretty simple. K through 12 involves children, minors, who are not yet fully adult and autonomous in their decision-making capacity, legally or otherwise, and higher ed involves adults. So very different standards. I do approve of practically everything that DeSantis is doing for K through 12, because I think the states have the authority to exert a great deal of control over what is taught and how it is taught, really plenary authority, because frankly, children have no First Amendment rights. I don't think they do. I mean, the Supreme Court disagrees with me in some ways, whereas adults do have rights, and also there are traditions of higher ed, of autonomy, to be free from overarching state control. So I can start with K through 12 and why I think it's important. Looking at my own situation and at some of the administration and the students of my university, I realized that a lot of the trouble starts in kindergarten. The way that our K through 12 system has been captured by a particular ideology that spends more time indoctrinating students and indoctrinating them to a kind of activist mindset, very left-leaning activist mindset, than sticking to business and what they ought to be doing. Also, our K through 12 system seems to have forgotten that children are minors, that they're not in the position to, quote unquote, make their own decisions about all sorts of things, that the state has plenary authority over what they're exposed to and what they're taught. And of course, this is pertinent to all of these cries of censorship. Censorship, you're taking particular topics, particular books out of the schools or out of school libraries. I think there is authority and good reason to do that. So for K through 12, what would I recommend? And what I recommend is very similar, I think, to what DeSantis is trying to do. I think there's a great model for what we should be doing, and that's why I call myself the radical reactionary. And that is going back to what K through 12 was like, certainly for me, growing up in upstate New York in the 1950s and 1960s. So what was it like? We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to go back to an older model. The first thing that's striking about my education is that sex was banned. What do I mean by that? The school never taught anything about sex at all, except just maybe the most rudimentary anatomical facts, and that very carefully. Okay, so there was this strong recognition this was not the purview of the schools, it was not in their wheelhouse, it belonged to private life and to parents. There was a recognition that sex is always moralized, and moral teachings were, once again, except in a very limited sense, not the business of the schools. So whenever any kind of gender or sex topic came up, the response was always the same: a steely look and ask your parents. Of course, that's not what we have today in the United States. We have an obsession with gender-related topics. All sorts of bizarre things are being taught to kindergartners. And of course, this spills over into the library wars. How sexually explicit are the materials in libraries going to be? And of course, the attitude back in Troy, New York, upstate New York, where I was raised, was we have to take a very strict view of what is age appropriate. And that means practically nothing, right? We take all that stuff out. If parents want to read sexually explicit stuff to their kids, we can't stop them. It's widely available. That's not censorship. You can get, a guide to putting on a condom on Amazon.com. Read it to your kids every night. So censorship is a misnomer for what I'm recommending here. So number one, banish sex. Number two, what about history, the sensitive topics of race, and all the stuff that we associate with critical race theory and DEI and all of that junk, wokeism, as we say? Well, I think we need a radical reset of a much more balanced approach to these topics, and we don't have that right now. We have the demonization of the West, of the United States, overemphasis on slavery, on discrimination, on minority rights and the treatment of minorities. I'm not saying those topics should be excluded, far from it, but I think there also needs to be an emphasis on the virtues of our system, the contributions of the West, American greatness, and all of those positive aspects. And right now, I'm sorry to say, Mr. Gray, that stuff is verboten. That is considered white supremacy. To, make a long list of what the West has contributed to modernity, which ought to be done, is impossible. That you just couldn't do that. I mean, part of the reason is, of course, the teachers know nothing about it. The teachers have not been educated along these lines. But I really think that is incredibly important. The bottom line here is twofold. Number one, the schools should become much less ambitious about what it is they are doing. They should have a much smaller footprint than they do in terms of, what they teach students and the topics. They should focus on the basics. And secondly, they should at all times defer to and recognize the authority of parents and other institutions of civil society to participate in and control what students are taught. Finally, I think the theme here is that schools should be conservative. And what do I mean by conservative? Well, first and foremost, to conserve and transmit information and important knowledge and tools about our culture and our country so that young people can function as adults and citizens in a democracy and a competitive, advanced economy. And the schools have plenty on their hands to do those things without getting into all of the nonsense that they've already gotten into. So, thumbs up for K through 12 reform that is utterly comprehensive and transformative. For higher ed, just to summarize briefly, because I am going on here, I think things get a little more complicated once again, because certainly for state systems, there is the First Amendment, which forbids the pushing certain viewpoints on adults, at least not pushing them sort of aggressively as the final word. And also, we have these traditions, these principles of academic freedom, of autonomy for these universities, for better or worse. Today, it's mostly for worse, I'm afraid. So the methods for reforming higher ed, I think, have to be different. One method I'm going to recommend here is the lever, the tool of federal funding. There are virtually no institutions of higher education, both state universities and private universities, that do not depend on hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funding. Essentially, the universities are crying foul and claiming autonomy, but they're doing it with taxpayer money. So that gives the government some levers to control how that money is spent. The first, of course, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is an anti-discrimination provision. And of course, the schools discriminate all over the place, and they're arrogant and proud of it, in admissions, in hiring, in controlling speech. I'm about to file a lawsuit that shows that my own university, Penn, treats anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian speech radically differently from anything critical of other sacred favored minorities. There is a total double standard, and that actually violates the anti-discrimination laws. So, there's lots of grounds for cutting off or reducing federal funding. That's a start. There's also a lot of leeway to control how universities are structured. So the growth of these diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies has been, once again, funded on the federal dime. It's been a dramatic development. And I think the government, the federal government, also the state governments, could demand, as a condition of receiving funds, that schools abolish their DEI offices, reduce their their administrative bureaucracies, change the way that they do things in that respect. And that would be perfectly legal. So there are some tools, there are some levers, but ultimately I think the reform for higher ed has to come from within.
Well, you weren't going on there at all. That was a pretty succinct summary of the entire American education system. And thank you for it, because a lot of our viewers won't know any of that. I certainly didn't know quite a lot of it. I did want to talk a little bit about the concern about what Ron DeSantis is doing, because in the press here in Britain, when we read about this, we often hear about creationism being introduced into American schools. Is that a sort of liberal bugbear, or a left liberal transatlantic bugbear, or is that something to be concerned about, that this sort of secular idea of K through 12 that you seem to be describing is also at risk of being hijacked by a conservative ideology?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, I understand that, that's the fear, but I truly do think that it is a distraction and a bugbear. I have not heard of any school districts, that have, I won't say tried to introduce creationism, but they certainly haven't succeeded. I think this is, just a fringe phenomenon. It hasn't gained any traction. I mean, to try to contrast it with, the transgender ideology, gender, affirming care. I hate that expression because it's so ideologically inflected. That is everywhere. I mean, the extremism here is on the left, not on the right. The right just, I think, by and large, wants to go back to an older model of civic education along the lines that I just proposed. Get these inherently moralized and controversial topics and areas out of the schools, transfer them to where they belong so that we can focus on actually imparting knowledge about our system. Here's something you really have to understand, and this is part of the motivation here. This is a non-ideological motivation. Students are abjectly ignorant, and this is demonstrated, of the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, math, our Constitution, our founding, our basic commitments. Take the First Amendment and free speech. They are propagandized. They honestly are, because they get to college and law school with these ideas in their head that, free speech and the First Amendment is some kind of nefarious tool of privileged white males that needs to be controlled and tamed. So, I think they just want to get all of that stuff out of the system and give a much more balanced picture of what our system actually is. So definitely the whole creationism thing is a bugbear. But let me just say this about creationism. I, of course, would oppose teaching creationism as, canonical and indisputed. But I can tell you that it's quite an interesting question, one that's probably too advanced for K through 12, even for high school. Why evolution wins out over creationism. It turns out to be, a bit of a challenge to explain that. Now, one of the lemmas here of the talks I've been giving is that we ought to really dial back the sophistication of what we expect from K through 12 students, turning K through 12 into some kind of debating society is the wrong way to go. These kids, and they are kids, they simply do not have the capacity, the tools, and the knowledge to debate a lot of contemporary hot button issues. They don't have the experience. Adults barely do. So let's give them the tools, that knowledge, so that they can go on into adult life and perhaps participate in some of these events, some of these debates. I do not think that the question, what is correct, evolution or creationism, has any place in K through 12, just for kind of practical, age appropriate reasons. And I would argue that.
I suppose the fear, certainly among the people who oppose sort of this Ron DeSantis style education, is that it is Christianity, not creationism, that is informing the educational program. And in fact, that they probably are right to be afraid of that to a certain extent, because Christianity is, after all, a classical education is, after all, in many ways, a Christian education in the way that we look at truth and things like that.
Well, as my dad used to tell my mom at the dinner table when she complained about, the Christmas pageants in our public school back in the late 50s, he said, "Judy, it's a Christian nation." I mean, the fact is that our tradition is Christian in origin. It's heavily informed by Christian ideas and ideals. And as long as you're not preaching that stuff, as the one and true way, which of course, shouldn't be happening in a public school, I think it's absolutely fine to teach about that. Because that is, our background, our nation. That is where a lot of our ideas come from. So I don't see the harm in that. I think there is a distinction to be made between indoctrination and preaching or whatever, proselytizing, whatever you want to call it, and presenting actual history, actual ideas, actual true picture of our nation. Frankly, once again, it's not the right that's doing that. It's the left. The left is presenting, this DEI view, radically egalitarian view, and, the cult of diversity as the one and only one approach that decent people can take. And anybody who's moral and good and right will adopt this view. And that is really happening. I mean, that is absolutely really happening. And no alternative is being presented to young people. When they come to me, they're already in their 20s, right? I teach a course called Conservative Political and Legal Thought. So many of the ideas that we discuss in the class are absolutely new to the students. And they've already been through, 12 years of education plus 4 years of college, very often in expensive and prestigious institutions. They're paying a lot of money for this one-sided education that they're getting. And I tell them that. I said, you've been cheated. And many of them, they get what I'm saying. They do.
Well, if we look at this sort of hijacking of K through 12 from when you were taught in school to now, can you point towards are there guilty men, guilty women perhaps, guilty transgender people even, who you can sort of point towards and say, these are the people who really wrecked a good education as you or I might understand it?
Well, I don't think, I would not point to any given individual, although Dewey probably is, I think his name is Thomas, he's often fingered as the culprit for his overarching theory of child-centered, child-directed education, which is kind of a generic idea, I guess. But I think I would, if I were to identify a culprit, it would probably be the education schools, which of course are part and parcel of the university. So I'm going to blame the university system, which has moved relentlessly left. It's been captured by this left-leaning intellectual elite class, and that has bled over into education schools, which are responsible for, creating our teacher core, I guess you could say. They have a monopoly on that, and I would definitely favor breaking that monopoly. That ought to be part of any reform movement. And what is taught in these education schools, and I will add that we're not sending our best to education schools. I'm really sorry to have to say that. So these are not the smartest people, even in the education system. Not that smarts immunizes you from really bad ideas. It doesn't. But they are relentlessly left-leaning and feminized. That's another big factor, is that women tend to be more left-leaning and progressive in their attitudes and in their political ideas than men. So they control the education schools, and they transmit and impart those ideas to newly minted teachers, and also this activist mindset, right? The idea that the purpose of education, the goal of education, is to change the world. And of course, how do we want to change it? We're not going to turn back the clock to 1959 in Troy, New York, not at all. We're going to change it in a progressive direction. So that's just, it's pervasive, it's everywhere. There's also one more factor going on here, which is what I would call the radically egalitarian, anti-meritocratic turn in education. And this, of course, is this ongoing desperate effort to close the gaps that persist and exist, and we haven't really made much progress on them, between minority educational achievement and the white and now Asian contingent. And so are there these very significant gaps. And anytime you have rigorous and meritocratic, standards, that gap is going to emerge. So let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of the content. Let's get rid of the hard stuff. And if we get rid of the content and the hard stuff and the tests and the skills demands, then that gap will disappear. Of course, that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Let me add, this is a bit of an aside, but this is relevant to this debate that is raging online about H-1B visas and the inadequacies of the American workforce and why we have to import all of these sort of middle skilled or semi-lower skilled engineering and STEM types from other countries, and specifically from India, which, because of its emphasis on English language and other cultural factors, historical factors, has been sending most of these people over to take these jobs. And one of the complaints, and Elon Musk participates in this, even though he's a Trump ally. He says, well, the American workforce lacks skills. They don't know what they're doing. They probably have other deficits as well. They don't want to work as hard. They're not as diligent, maybe. There's all sorts of things you could say about them. But one of them is they don't know anything. So we have, I think, a real problem in the United States that we have put the meritocracy under a shadow, and we've abolished gifted programs. We're not pushing people at the top of the educational food chain as hard as we used to. We're much more concerned about, equality rather than excellence. We've shifted away from excellence to equality, and it shows in the quality of our workforce. So that creates problems in the employment sphere, in the immigration sphere. It emanates in all sorts of ways throughout society, produces tensions and conflicts and divides. It's really not a good thing.
But I suppose one of the advantages that America has is a degree of subsidiarity, or the ability of states or more localized institutions that run educational programs to do their own thing. And you see that happening all over America. You see that at the higher education level. You see new universities being set up. You see that with Ron DeSantis' program. You saw that in the fight back against critical race theory in Virginia. Critical race theory in schools, I should say. I mean, wouldn't you say that's where the American Constitution works in your favor?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The education system, and that includes, every aspect of it, is highly decentralized in the United States. And that's the good news and the bad news, all right? Because it's good news for conservatives. They love subsidiarity. They love decentralization. They love dispersions of power, right? That's the Whiggish impulse in conservatives, because it's closer to the people, and the people's will can prevail on the one hand. But on the other hand, it makes any kind of meaningful reform much more arduous and difficult, because you have to go district by district, state by state. I think the state education departments are very critical here. And as Oscar Wilde said, that takes too many evenings. You can't kind of orchestrate it from above. So that's hard, because a lot of these school boards, a lot of these districts have been captured by what, I think are bad ideas. Perhaps the real locus of reform is state education departments, but there are 50 of those. So when young people come to me and say, what can I do? How can I change things? And they're not thinking about, change to the left. They're thinking about how can we move things in a more conservative direction. I always say, get married, have children, join your school board. get involved in your state Department of Education, because that is where the action is. That is where real reform has to take place. And frankly, I'm sorry to say, at the end of the day, this is a political question. It requires persuasion. It requires capturing hearts and minds. It requires showing people why the current trends and system and the way things are working is, needs to be changed. I think some of that occurred during the COVID era when parents were looking over the shoulder of their children who were being taught remotely, and they were not happy with what they saw, just for all sorts of reasons. The basics weren't being taught. Their kids couldn't read. They were doing new math, right? All sorts of nonsense, which they were very dubious about. And also the political indoctrination, right? The alarming talk about sex and gender, to kindergartners and first graders. I mean, absurd things like that. So I think that started to create some disgruntlement. How much is very hard to know. I think it did contribute to Trump's, purchase, to his popularity, to people turning to the right. But we still have a lot of people who are true believers for the present model. And unfortunately, many of those people are so-called educated elites, especially the female contingent, who are really into the whole progressive mindset about education and the way it ought to be done, sort of child-centeredness, the importance of, debate and political, infusing education with all of these political ideas, political priorities against making education hard, merit, testing, standards, the whole litany still has quite a grip on a lot of people's thinking. I would say abolish the education schools. Maybe that would be a start. One reform would be, we don't accept as qualifications for teaching in this state getting a degree from an education school. You have to have a four-year college degree in a substantive area, and you could list the measures that you will accept for teachers.
Well, you mentioned abolishing there, and you also mentioned Donald Trump, who will be president in 10 days' time. President again, I should say. And he has talked, or at least his campaign has talked, about abolishing the Department of Education. And he has a new education secretary nominated, Linda McMahon, one of his donors. What do you think about what's going on there?
Well, I'm all for shrinking the size of government. I often, in my reactionary fashion, say, gee, when I was in college, 71 to 75, the education department didn't even exist. And, aren't I great? So you really have to ask yourself, well, what are they doing? And look under the hood. I would like to look under the hood of what the education department is doing. I think that Trump needs a kind of Doge-like review. If I were coming in as president, I would say, Ms. McMahon, please tell me what the heck your department is doing, what money you're spending and what you're spending it on. And can we get rid of some of this stuff or transfer a lot of it out to other departments? Let's go back in time and see how things used to be organized. But, there's always proliferation of programs. As Michael Oakeshott said, the felt need of, any deficit, any deficiency, any social problem is met with the idea, we need a program and we need to spend money and we need to intervene. And just that whole mentality, I think, is what's underlying the education department. So it's not just abolishing the department that I think will do the job. I think it's just a shift in the entire way that we think about education and the way that the federal government deals with education. I would just say, what are you doing can't we get rid of all this stuff?
Well, on that note, I think we should end it there. And I hope Linda McMahon sees this interview and takes note. Amy Wax, thank you very much for coming on to the Americano Show.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for the show. If you enjoyed it, let us know. And if you didn't, also tell us, and we won't ever do it again. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.